And the topic is Lacan and Philosophy. And I'll be the chair. I'm William Loyinger, and I teach at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. And our speakers tonight are Richard Boothby from Loyola, Baltimore, Daniel Tutt from George Washington University, Wilfried from Georgetown, and Tad DeLay from Baltimore City Community College. And Richard Boothby from Loyola, Baltimore will be going first. And his paper is called The Sacred Nothing, Lacanian Theory of Religion. So Richard, you can go ahead. I think we'll go about 30 minutes per speaker and maybe 15 minutes of questions after each speaker, or at least we'll aim for that. All right, so go ahead, Richard.
Okay, great. I'm really happy to have the time at the end because I'll really welcome questions. I'm right in the middle of finishing the final edit of this text for Northwestern Press to publish. It's been a long time coming, and the actual title is Nothing Sacred? The God Question from Freud to Lacan. And it really takes off from a kind of double angle. The first, and there's two parts of the book. The first part is opening up the whole problematic that Lacan gives us in the beginning of the ethics seminar, the question of das Ding, the thing, which he takes, of course, from a brief but very provocative text in Freud's Project for a Scientific Psychology. There he divides the other human being, the Nebenmensch, which of course is originally the mother, into two parts. What he says we can recognize, or the child recognizes, by its mirroring its body, therefore already in Freudian terms, making it a wonderful intersection with Lacanian understanding of the imaginary and the problem of the ego. And on the other hand, what Freud says is somehow non-comparable and unthinkable, which he can simply call das Ding, the thing, the unknown thing in the other. This concept I've been onto for a long time, and it appears in my other work, but it's increasingly fascinated me. And at somewhere along the line in the last few years, it began to dawn on me more and more that this is a key concept for Lacan, and particularly the problematic of religion for Lacan. What's kind of fascinating about this double problem of das Ding on the one hand and the problem of religion on the other is that Lacan seems to take a step back from both. As anyone knows who's read much of Lacan, he's constantly referring to religious figures, religious texts, religious problematics, but he never produces anything like a coherent theory of religion. In fact, he really expressly steps back from doing so, and even calls the enterprise of putting all religions in some kind of comparative status a kind of fool's errand at best. But it strikes me that nevertheless his approach to religion is so interestingly more exploratory, more sympathetic, even with his avowed atheism, than the very provocative and almost ferocious critique of Freud, that it was really kind of irresistible for me to look into this question of what might a Lacanian conception of religion look like. And it increasingly seemed to me that this angle, focusing on what is unknown in the other, was really made to order. And as I got into it and began rereading Lacan with this in mind, I began finding more and more connections that were really suggestive. The thing itself, however, is odd in Lacan's teaching. After the seventh seminar, where he introduces it in the first half with great, marking of its importance, he puts it, as he says at one point, at the kind of center of gravitation of all the unconscious Vorstellungen, all the kind of world of unconscious connections and so on is kind of in some sense rotating around this question of the unknown thing in the other. But he very seldom mentions it after that seventh seminar. In fact, in the second half, where he devotes the problem to Antigone, he barely mentions it even there. He does, however, return to it at some key points. One key point is the year, 1 year after, in the eighth seminar, he comes back and talks about the transference seminar. He talks about sublimation, where he had defined sublimation as raising the object to the dignity of das Ding. And in the transference seminar, he changes that and says sublimation functions to provide a kind of cordon of defense against the unknown and otherwise intolerable thing. Then 2 years after that, in the anxiety seminar, he again makes, just to my knowledge, only a single reference, but an absolutely crucial reference. He says, anxiety, unlike Freud's conception, which lacked an object, does have an object. The most profound object, he says, the thing. So there in the anxiety seminar, if we give that sentence its proper weight, and it seems to me you can read it back through the whole of the seminar and it makes perfect sense. What he's saying is this encounter with what is unknown in the fellow human being is what tips the human being fundamentally at the most basic level into anxiety. As he puts it there, the question remains open, what object I am for this unknown desire of the other. Then in subsequent seminars, in the 16th seminar and the 20th seminar, he again comes back to das Ding, but it seems to me that it's still kind of an unanswered question. I deal with it briefly in the book, but it's an unanswered question why he prescinds from developing it. The idea of das Ding is largely taken over, its function in his theoretical framework. It seems taken over by the objet A. But even the objet A is intimately connected. As he remarks in the 16th seminar, in a very brief passage, he says, objet A is, he says, what tickles das Ding from the inside, indicating in this kind of suggestive and kind of comic offhand remark, I think a very profound connection. And I've written about that too in some separate papers and so on. But what really gets me about this and what interests me so much is that das Ding in this framing, linking it so intimately with anxiety, with sublimation, is that it also seems to me to be the key, if we take it and really use it, to Lacan's most fundamental postures, most fundamental postulation, that human desire is the desire of the other, that we come to ourselves outside ourselves. But in addition, it shifts the whole question of the Oedipus, where Freud wanted to talk about the way in which the child has to be separated from the mother, particularly the male child, under the threat of paternal castration. The Lacanian rereading from the point of view of das Ding is the child separates him or herself in view of wanting to take a distance from this unknown, come to terms in some way by first of all establishing a kind of defensive cordon. The paternal metaphor would seem to be exactly a description of this process, where the function of the signifier intervenes to provide a kind of half step back, a naming which is both a pointing to what is there, but also a kind of distancing from it. You could say, and I talk about this in the text, you could say that this simultaneous naming, connecting, but also distancing is very similar to the Hegelian Aufhebung, which both negates and preserves, a real dual function. And you therefore can link up the Lacanian notion of the signifier at the most primitive level on this kind of dual opposing axis. It's also, of course, this twofold function, very suggestively parallel with Freud. In particular, his notion of the symptom, which both serves to repress some impulse, but also to express it. It both distances the subject from something unconscious, but also, you might say, samples it, flirts with it, somehow draws up a relation with it. And this gives me some connection to the problematic of religion. Freud, as you remember, in the early essay on obsessive actions and religious practices, talks about the crucial role of symptom formation in its dual function, both repressing and expressing. Religion intimately related to this symptom formation, the compromise of the symptom. And if the relationship to das Ding in the subject is this kind of profound ambivalence, both wanting to draw close, but also needing to protect itself, defend itself against this unknown dimension of the other, then it would seem to be already linking up with one of the main ways that Freud conceives, psychoanalytically speaking, the structure and the inner dynamic of the religious. Once I'm off on that sort of angle, I then go through a series of analyses of different religions, starting with the three that are most influential and well-known in the Western tradition: Greek polytheism, Judaism, and Christianity. And I trace the presence of das Ding and this dual function of wanting to both access it, but also defend against it. Therefore, a deeply symptomatic function, deeply symptomatic structure in each of the three religions, but very, very different in the three. So to very briefly go through these, I'm going to associate each of them with a particular quotation from Lacan and then say a few really brief things about them. To begin with Greek polytheism. The quote is, and actually I'm going to give you two quotes here to begin. The first thing he says about the Greek pagan outlook, religiously speaking, is a bit shocking. He says, the gods are a mode by which the real is revealed. What is strange about this is not so much the real part, understanding the sacred as some kind of encounter with the unthinkable real doesn't surprise us. In fact, that would be continuous with a long tradition in theology of so-called negative or apophatic theology, where God or the divine is somehow in itself inexpressible, ineffable, unthinkable. The real in Lacan's sense would therefore be always and from the get-go assimilable to something like the negative theological experience of the divine. What's weird in his phrase, the gods, the pagan gods here, are a mode by which the real is revealed, is the revealed part. Isn't the real exactly what never appears, what is not cognizable, either in an image or in a signifier? So what does he mean? Well, the other comment he makes, relevant to the pagan universe and to temple of the Greek pagan religious sensibility, links us back to the das Ding. He says, the temple is a construction around an emptiness that designates the place of the thing. So here he is expressly bringing in his concept of das Ding and making it really, in some sense, the centerpiece, the sort of central function, central action, the central reality of the pagan religious experience. Well, this would link it immediately with Freud's analysis of the pagan gods, where he says in The Future of an Illusion that the gods were stand-ins for natural forces. They were personifications of natural forces. We can translate that idea back into these Lacanian terms, it seems to me, so long as we remember that for the pagan, everything was a force. They really had no concept of what we call things or objects, mere sort of inert, dead, inactive and passive objects that we simply operate on. On the contrary, they thought of everything: water, fire, blood, flesh, death-dealing bronze, Homer calls it, as though bronze is itself actively lethal, dangerous in itself. A stone is obviously a force of its own. If you just pick it up, it pushes back on your hand. If everything is a force, the companion idea is that force is in some sense unplumbable, unknowable. We can know its effects, but we don't have any insight into the force itself. And this aligns with the Greek polytheistic conception of the gods, who are the stronger than human forces, which we human beings, we mere mortals, can never fully fathom. We cannot understand them. So not only did the Athenians have a marker, a little altar dedicated to the unknown god, worried that they might miss a god in their sacrificial observances, miss a kind of bow to all the gods. So they set up a sort of catch-all, the unknown, the altar to the unknown god. But they also have the idea that all the gods, the divine intentions, are ultimately inscrutable. From this point of view, Greek divinity directly embodies das Ding, the unknown, inscrutable desire of the other. And religious life then becomes a question of posturing oneself in relation to that unknown. For the Greeks, according to the way argument I develop in this book, the heroic option was one of posturing oneself with self-possession, self-control, self-respect in the midst and over and against this unknown power that's bigger than me. So the question is not ever understanding it. The question is only, you might say, positioning myself with myself at the center of things under the control that I do exert. Therefore, we can make sense of something like Agamemnon's comment that battle is the test of honor, that the battle test that lets us define ourselves. We don't know what ultimately drives the world, but have to conduct ourselves with our self-respect as best we can. And that becomes, on my argument, really the essence of this Greek sense of the religious. It's almost as though the hero's conduct is a kind of diamond, which is set on the black velvet pillow that we see at the jeweler's shop, where the black velvet is actually the sort of bottomless unknown, at the abyss at the basis of existence that we all basically have to contend with. With Judaism, we have Lacan's quote about the symbolic as the basis of what was made into God. But the symbolic here we meet speaking for the first time. The Greek gods, of course, they do say things. They're often ventriloquized by other mortals. When Athena stays the hand of Achilles as he's about to pull his sword on Agamemnon in the opening of the Iliad, we can't quite imagine that the relation is direct. But when Yahweh speaks to Abraham, it's disarmingly direct. And Abraham is faced with a kind of enigma about what this voice wants. From a Lacanian point of view, the Judaic God who wants a covenant with Abraham is an overwhelming kind of presencing of the other in all of its inscrutability. The terms of the covenant seem clear, at least on some basic level, although also absurd. Abraham will be made the father of a great nation, if only he excises the flap of skin from the tip of his organ. It's almost a ludicrous deal on any measure of appropriate balance. And then it's yet again upset and made almost absurd when the next thing that Yahweh asks of him is, in effect, take the product of your procreation, Isaac, and give him on Mount Moriah as a sacrifice, apparently taking back the very thing that he had offered in his covenant with Abraham. The result, I argue, and this is of course extremely truncated, but the result is that the Jewish people find themselves in an overwhelming intimacy with a single deity whose intentions remain profoundly unknown. The law that Yahweh lays down, particularly when it comes to Moses, is in one sense clear. There are 10 of these commandments and they're fairly simple in their signification, but the real meaning remains open in a way that's quite disturbing. And Judaism, therefore, as Lacan wants to emphasize it, is, as he reads it, is the religion of the signifier par excellence, the religion for which interpreting the law is piety. And therefore, the contestations of the Talmud are considered by many Jewish sects to be on an equal par with the crucial dignity and important centrality of Torah. That the contestation is part of the relationship with this God, whose law is laid down in covenant, but not ever fully transparent. I'm noticing the time, but I'm going to move along a little more quickly. What then happens with Christianity? One might think, in fact, it's really tempting to suppose that Lacan's understanding of Judaism, particularly when he goes through the 10 commandments and shows, I think quite compellingly, and I try to reproduce his argument, that the 10 commandments really are laying down the law of the human relation to the signifier. You could say that this religion of the symbolic par excellence would be Lacan's pick for the most illustrative religion that shows what he's really after, but he doesn't. Not only does he say that about Christianity instead of Judaism, but he says it with this incredibly provocative statement. This is from the 1974 interview in Italy, where he makes this incredibly provocative remark. There is one true religion, he says, and that is the Christian religion. He doesn't elaborate. We don't know really very much at all about what he means by this really almost inflammatory statement, and very surprising coming from a psychoanalyst. Is this true just as an exemplar of religious life? Or is it true in some more substantive sense as really corresponding to reality? He doesn't say. But I take this to be this clue, this provocative remark, to be the key in the following way: that Christianity, as Lacan reads it, actually does return us to the original primordial, as it were, prehistoric site of the experience of the unknown in the other. That is to say, in Christ's injunction to love the neighbor as thyself, what we have is the relationship to das Ding demanded by us in an absolutely general, unrestrained way. We have to put ourselves at risk, you might say, before the question of the jouissance of the other, a question which will ultimately double back upon us, confronting us with the question of our own unconscious. What really makes this distinctive, particularly in relation to Judaism, is where Jesus adds not only love thy neighbor, that had already appeared in Torah. In Leviticus, we have love thy neighbor as thyself. What's really distinctive is when Jesus, and it's very self-conscious in Jesus's discourses, he says, not only do I demand you love the neighbor, you must love your enemy. And Lacan expressly cites this and reminds us true love is not, of course, simply finding in the other things that flatter my sense of myself. True love is finding in the other what threatens me and embracing that. Therefore, Lacan says, the love of the neighbor is always already. True love is embrace of the enemy. The neighbor's jouissance is bound to be always partly threatening to me. So the Christ injunction toward love, not of a transcendent God, but a God who actually is realized in relation between human beings. Jesus says, of course, I am there wherever two or more of you are gathered. Or as you treat the least among you, you treat me. These immanentizing statements, I think, are very much what Lacan has in mind. And it strikes me also that, and I spend a lot of time talking about this, this parallels Hegel's view of Christianity. The Pauline transformation of Christ's mission into a redemptive sacrifice, which wins for human beings survival in the next life, is not at all for Hegel what Hegel's interested in, neither is it what Lacan's interested in. The distinctiveness of the Christian religion, and the reason I try to argue why he can make this otherwise rather crazy sounding remark, Christianity is the one true religion, is Christianity is not the religion of the imaginary, like the imaginary heroism of the Greek, nor the religion of the symbolic, the Judaic reverence for the word and its interpretation, but rather the religion of the real, the religion that poses the real directly in front of us in our relationship to the fellow human being, which is ultimately, this is the great paradox, the great shock of his concept of das Ding, the truly abyssal and dangerous encounter is the encounter with the fellow human being. And Christianity puts its whole weight behind the demand that we straightforwardly and unflinchingly enter that encounter. Okay, William, I have other stuff, but I'm gonna shut up and let other people ask questions and discuss.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks for the paper. All right, anybody have questions?
I thought that was very inspiring, Richard. I like the point of Christianity is the one true religion. It's the one religion of the real, which centers das Ding as well. So in a way, Christianity deals with das Ding perhaps most adequately. And then I was wondering if that's true. Also, you know, all of that research since Jakob Tobe's incredible seminars on St. Paul in the 1990s, which Derrida fell into, and then later Zizek and Alain Badiou and Giorgio Agamben all wrote about St. Paul as the founder of universalism. But one thing that's also noteworthy, I think, is that Paul treats the Das Ding of Christianity in a certain way. And I wonder if you get into Paul's sort of relation to the Das Ding of the event of the cross, I imagine, right, would be what it is for Paul, and that this is then elevated as this kind of irrational point and so on, right, that must be affirmed. So do you see St. Paul in that way as the figure who is kind of formalizing the Christian's relationship to the Das Ding in a way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel. One of the things that I've come to really appreciate more and put at the center of the argument I'm making here is that the Lacanian big other, the symbolic big other, which some people are tempted to think, well, that's something like God, right? I mean, I think it's actually almost the opposite, that the big other, the symbolic big other, as a kind of defensive cordon against this exposure to raw jouissance, either in the other or in myself, exposure to Das Ding. The symbolic big other, that's its opposition to the little other. The little other is actually the really uncanny thing, not the symbolic big other, which I also take to be the reason why Lacan says the outcome of a really successful psychoanalysis is the realization on the part of the analysand that the big other does not exist, that there is no protection anymore, that we're fully exposed to our own unconscious and to the traces of the unconscious in the other, which Lacan calls Das Ding. The question of Paul is a really interesting one in Lacan, but it seems to me it's mostly, he does appreciate, he refers to Paul all the time as the one who lays down the law, but in the very same stroke, structures the violation of the law as part of the inevitable path of desire in coming to itself. But I also think that Lacan is pretty, though he doesn't pronounce upon it this way, I think Lacan is implicitly quite invested in something akin to Nietzsche's critique of Paul, which is very different of the one than the sort of one of Badiou and Zizek and Agamben and so on. It's the Paul who cheats. Also, Hegel accuses Paul of the same thing, that Paul changes the terms, actually lightening the trauma that Christ faces us with in his demand that we open ourselves unrestrainedly to what is unknown in the other, even what is unknown, of course, in the enemy. Paul, as it were, changes the rules of the game and says, in effect, Christ is not asking you to do something impossible. He's laying down your prescription for your own salvation if you simply follow the rules, as it were, follow the big other, where the real challenge is this much more immediate relationship to what faces you existentially.
So Nietzsche sort of Nietzsche thinks that Paul domesticates the radicalism of Christ's message in a way.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's one of the reasons why he makes the famous remark, there really was only one Christian and he died on the cross.
Okay, thank you.
So I see Gerald. Gerald, you want to ask a question?
Yes, yes. Thank you for this talk. Beautiful. A comment and then a question. Yeah. Just thinking about temporally the development of these three religions, from the Greek and their many gods to Judaism, the Old Testament, and then Christianity, the New Testament. maybe that does reflect to some extent Lacan's imaginary, the symbolic, and later the real. So it might be something there. And then the question, one of the other participants here affirmed that I did hear you say that Lacan had a ferocious attack on Freud, ferociously attacked Freud. And I know so little in some ways about Lacan, but I'm enjoying the ride over the years, and could you, it must have just gotten by me so far about about Lacan's ferocious attack on Freud. Just speak to that just for a moment, if you would. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think you misheard a little bit, Gerald, because what I was wanting to say was that Freud's attack on religion was ferocious. In other words, that Freud.
That's fine. I got it then. Totally. Yeah. Freud's attack on
But
religion.
your underlying question is really interesting, though, and really important. I mean, exactly how does Lacan take his distance from Freud? And in the last 6 or 8 years, when I've been working on this book, I've come to appreciate more than ever, and maybe I'm sort of digging myself into my own sort of position even more deeply. I was somewhat here before in earlier work, but I'm really very convinced, and somebody will have to talk me out of it, that Lacan increasingly over the trajectory of his seminars distances himself from Freud's formulation of the Oedipus complex. And I kind of basically say, what he really replaces it with is an idea of Freud himself, the complex der Nebenmensch, the complex of das Ding, which shifts everything. It shifts it into Lacanian terms. It shifts it from the threat of castration, forcing a separation from the mother, where the problem is the child's desire for the mother that has to be broken or given up. It shifts it to the mother's desire as an unknown, therefore as having the dimensions of jouissance in all of its threatening character, as well as attractive character. Of course, that ambivalence is key to what Lacan wants to get out of this, it seems to me. But that distancing, I think, only becomes more obvious, especially maybe the anxiety seminar really is clear about this, where he's really taking distance from Freud and openly calling Freud's framing of the Oedipus complex a kind of myth in the negative and pejorative sense of the term.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I see both Professor Varecki and Tad. How about Tad first and then Wilfried second?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, just a stereotypical comment more than a question, but I just want to say, I think that you're absolutely right about in my book on Lacan and theology, I was really interested in this term das Ding that shows up a lot in Seminar 7 and then just kind of disappears by Seminar 11. And I think what I heard you say perhaps was that Seminar 10 is kind of the hinge point, the seminar on anxiety, where he kind of talks about das Ding and objet A side by side, and then after that, das Ding starts to go away. That was certainly my reading. And I also think, and I only know this because my paper is largely on the Freud's paper on negation. In Seminar 7, Lacan talks about das Ding showing up in the 1925 negation essay from Freud. And if you look at that essay, it means nothing, das Ding means nothing close to what Lacan is talking about, right? It's not a vase, it's not an emptiness, it's not an objet A, it's just like something that someone gets in their head and can't accept in reality. So anyways, sorry, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I just wanted to kind of say, like, I think you're exactly right that Seminar 10 seems to be the hinge point, and he's doing something completely his own after. And I think that seems to be why Objet A displaces Das Ding as his sort of focal point of like the thing that has to be filled, that can't be defined, that's a missing object, and so forth. So anyways, I appreciated your lecture. I thought that was great.
Tad, we absolutely have to get together. I was realizing after having you show up here, and it came back in my brain that I actually have read your other book on psychoanalysis and the unconscious. You co-wrote with somebody, as I remember it, right? But was that just you? Did you?
I've never co-wrote a book. Yeah, I've shown up in some anthologies and so forth, but I've never co-wrote. But
we definitely
we'll have to connect sometime.
To talk about this with you. That'll be really a great privilege. Sign of my advancing senility that I slipped the cog on that.
All right, Wilfried.
Yes. Richard, you are saying that love the neighbor as yourself includes an invitation, if I understood you, to know the unknown in the other. So this is quite a deeper interpretation than I had. Love the neighbor as yourself. Well, yeah, you just accept them, but are you indicating that it is not accepting, but it is an invitation to understand the other, including the unknown in the other?
I think that the emphasis I want to put on it, which I take is Lacan's emphasis, is it's not so much knowing what is unknown, but being open to what you don't know, being open to accommodating to it, where the accommodation is what's going to really cost you something. In other words, it strikes me that when Lacan says that human desire is the desire of the other, and when he thereby implies that we come to our own unconscious desire through some kind of relationship we have with the other, we sort of, you might say, discover ourselves outside ourselves. This process is fundamentally threatening, and we resist it. You could say it's the very meaning of the psychoanalytic concept of resistance, that we resist this approach of something deeply foreign. He stresses from the absolutely first instance that Das Ding is something strange and framed. It's deeply foreign and threatening, yet it is absolutely crucial. And the interesting thing, I talk a lot about how, and again, Lacan doesn't develop this. One of the more intriguing and you could say risky things about what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to draw out and make more explicit what Lacan clearly does not, either on the question of Das Ding or on the question of religion. And I do speculate a little bit about why he prescinds from doing that. Why is it that he doesn't chase this down more? He lets us ride off in the sunset with his concept of objet A and not Das Ding, and he is quite clear about his own reticence about coming up with a general theoretical approach to the problem of religion. I think they may be related. These two things are actually interconnected, that he saw something of the connection, but he didn't want to go in that direction, mostly for fear of being, I think, misunderstood. Either that misunderstood as a religious thinker, or misunderstood as, you might say, almost kind of domesticating Das Ding, or even reifying it, turning it into a kind of substantial reality, when actually it is something that is purely supposed on the part of the subject. Das Ding is, if anything at all, something that the subject purely supposes. There's no, as he likes to put it at one point, the thing is also the non-thing, the nothing. So that really is something like the pure emptiness. And here you could link up his concept of Das Ding with a lot of quasi-existential postures, I think, about the pure opening, the pure phenomenal field in all of its indeterminacy.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So why don't we now move on to Daniel's paper. So Daniel Tutt from George Washington.
Thank you all. Thank you, William. Well, that will be hard to follow. I wish that we were all in person, but this is probably for the best. So what I want to look at tonight is a question of discourse. Lacan's Seminar 17 obviously introduces the theory of the discourses. I'm obsessed with that seminar, having read it many times. Recently, my study collective, my study circle, studied this seminar that comes after it, Seminar 18, which is entitled On a Discourse That Might Not Be a Semblant, which I'm going to talk about tonight, because it revises an early concept, which is extremely important concept, first introduced in Seminar 3 on the psychoses, which is the concept of the quilting point. So the title of my paper is Why Lacan Abandons the Concept of Quilting Point. So from Bentham to Marx, because Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, is actually a philosophical influence, according to many commentators, of Lacan, especially in his early period, and especially in terms of this notion of quilting point. So the idea of quilting point refers to how the symbolic attaches to the real, right? So in other words, it's a theory of how a signifier, we could say a signifier, either a master signifier, which kind of coheres or gives order to a signifying chain, or a more primordial signifier like the name of the Father, attaches to the symbolic. So therefore it is a theory of metaphor, right? If you don't have a quilting point, you have a metonymy, right? You have a kind of reign of difference across signifiers. So therefore, quilting point is a theory of signification. It's also a theory of meaning. At the same time, it also holds together the signifier with the real as a stop point and reveals a certain hollowness or the hole in the signifier at the same time that it is expressed in the symbolic. For the psychotic, and we see this especially for President Schreber, Lacan says the signifier is heard, but nothing in his subjectivity is able to respond to it because the quilting point function is defective. The specific figure that signifier that is foreclosed for the great President Schreber is the primordial signifier that Lacan says, quote, represents an indeterminate support around which there is grouped and condensed a number, not even of meanings, but a series of meanings, which come and converge by means of and starting from the existence of this signifier. Now, the onset of Schreber's psychosis occurs at the moment when this essential signifier, which holds together all of these other signifiers, is unable to be received, when it is foreclosed. And that's Lacan's sort of basic definition of the onset of psychosis. So you see the importance of quilting point there. However, the concept of quilting point is not merely a clinical concept. And I want to argue that the idea of it has stakes in metapsychology. Now, here by metapsychology, I mean generally the philosophical problems that animate Lacan's development of clinical concepts, such as, what is the ontological basis of the unconscious? What is the relation of enjoyment to the body and to language? These metapsychological questions are often worked through with the aid of philosopher reference points, from Heidegger to Kant to Hegel to Bentham and to Marx. Furthermore, the concept of quilting point itself can be understood far more broadly than a specific clinical concept meant for the treatment of an adolescent. The concept is, in fact, what points to a logic of signification and the way that, as Wilfried Seller says, the way that things broadly hold together. The concept thus allows us to make connections to a theory of discourse and to a theory of ideology, as well as these wider metapsychological problems. The theory of the quilting point is, according to Slavoj Žižek, why Lacan is not to be read as a post-structuralist. Because in Žižek's reading, Lacan does not affirm, as does, say, Derrida and many other kind of French Nietzschean philosophers, that textual difference never arrives at a point of signification, i.e., the quilting point is one way to differentiate Lacanian psychoanalysis as a method of cultural critique and analysis of subjectivity that is itself strongly different from deconstruction, in that deconstruction emphasizes the impossibility of signification. Furthermore, for politics, a quilting point refers to how a master signifier organizes a field of political meaning and adheres the performance of the agents within that field or discourse to it. One of the problems of the later Lacan, especially in his seminar called The Non-Duped Heir, is a crisis of our contemporary culture that is plagued by what we might call a fundamental atonality of quilting points, i.e., an impossibility of master signifiers to cohere a discourse. There's something that has disrupted social bonds, because a quilting point forges also a social bond that becomes efficacious for the agents engaged in that bond. In Seminar 18, Lacan says the notion of quilting point needs to be fundamentally rethought, right? And in this rethinking, I think that he's raising a metapsychological point as to whether there even is a rapport between enjoyment and the signifier any longer. He changes the logic of the relationship between jouissance, or I'm just going to call jouissance enjoyment, since we're an English-speaking group of Lacanians here, make it easier on us. Although some could argue that jouissance has multiple meanings, and I'm not saying that that it doesn't. But what I am saying is that these questions of the status of enjoyment in relationship to language raises wider problems for the issue of political epistemology, i.e., how are political and social antagonisms managed? How are they assessed? And how are they taken up by political actors, especially oppressed or classed subjects? The second area that I'm interested in is how, in a world in which master signifiers or quilting points no longer adhere a meaning or a hook of meaning or a quilting point of meaning or a latch of meaning, does that have an effect on social power and what Marxists call impersonal domination, right? Because Marxists argue in something called reification, which is that social relations mirror that of the impersonal exchange of commodities, right? That is part of what Lacan is trying to say, which is that when he turns to Marx as the ontological foundation of what he's thinking about enjoyment, precisely surplus enjoyment, and the way that surplus enjoyment, just like the surplus that capital depends upon for its reproduction, the effect of that is a new theory of alienation and a new theory of domination, right? Within discourse. This is what Bernard Stiegler calls a new form of symbolic misery, right? And he says that this symbolic misery faces the proletariat of today's age in a different way than the proletariat faced it in the 19th century. So that distinction is very important to me, because what we're talking about is not real domination of people that have to work at Walmart in like wage labor conditions, although that's extremely significant. And I do want to mention aspects of that, but we're actually talking about a form of symbolic exclusion and immiseration by virtue of what Lacan calls the proliferation of the university and capitalist discourse, which has produced a certain conjuncture within modern society that Jacques-Alain Miller refers to as the era of the inexistence of the other. Very enigmatic, esoteric frame of reference there. We can talk about that in a minute. But let me go back. And the title of this section now is called The Tension Between Kant and Bentham in Lacan's Early Thought. So by the time of Seminar 7 on the Ethics, Lacan extends the notion of quilting point to refer to the rapport that exists between the signifier and enjoyment, specifically how what he calls real enjoyment or real jouissance latches onto the symbolic. There is a philosophical question here related to Kant in the sense that he tries to point out that Kant's ethics have a homologous relation to the libertine ethics of the Marquis de Sade and the Marquis de Sade's universe of Republican maxims of pleasure, that they actually cohere a law of desire, which is similar to Kant's ethical maxims of reason and of the categorical imperative. We learn that Kant's ethical maxims actually have a homologous relation to the laws of pleasure in de Sade, and that there is thus a kind of deontological basis to psychoanalysis' ethical privileging of desire as a maxim, for which we receive this beautifully famous maxim of Lacan, which is do not give ground relative to your desire, right? Which the philosopher Alain Badiou will create an entire Marxian ethics based on this. As Miller has pointed out, there are two tensions in the metapsychology of enjoyment during the ethics seminar. First, Lacan is concerned with what he calls the real of jouissance, and he importantly develops the idea of the das Ding, or the thing-like dimension of enjoyment. Now, what Miller says this concept seeks to demonstrate is that satisfaction related to drive is found in the real, and there is thus a symbolic and imaginary barrier that are both symbolized and conditioned by a withdrawal outside of the thing. So das Ding therefore reduces jouissance to an empty place that is equivalent to the barred subject or the divided subject. And the mother steps in the place of this emptiness of das Ding. And jouissance is inaccessible to the subject. And Miller says something important. Because jouissance is inaccessible to the subject, there is a fundamental lie or a fundamental relation of deception that the subject therefore has to enjoyment. Enjoyment becomes a problem of what Miller calls a primal deceitfulness. He says a primal deceitfulness hangs over enjoyment. And this is part of the severing disjunction between signifier and jouissance that makes Kant's antinomies, because we know that Kant is a great thinker of antinomies and sort of points of uncognizability, right? It's a different dialectic than Hegel's. So when you are thinking antinomous structures, you often rely on the Kantian philosophy. Now, the antinomy at the heart of enjoyment here is why the ethics seminar, Lacan investigates figures and elevates figures of tragedy, especially Antigone, whose theory of the act is so radical precisely because she pushes the barrier of this forbidden enjoyment and aims ethics at that zone of impossibility. Now, it's a beautiful aside that during the time of the ethics seminar was a communist uprising in Algeria, and Lacan had a relative who was imprisoned for her communist militancy, who I believe was the daughter of the philosopher Georges Bataille. I don't know if you know this story. It's a very fascinating story, and she becomes the model almost of Antigone. She wrote to Lacan from her prison cell. So the model of ethics is associated with what we might call a tragic paradigm of impossible, aiming ethics towards an impossible achievement. Okay. What we see emerge here is an important antinomy at the heart of Lacan's ethics and concepts, and this antinomy is based on the problem of the real, or what is also called massive jouissance. It is the status of enjoyment as such that erects certain barriers that have political and clinical implications. And to address this impasse, Lacan will invent a theory of the act. The analyst must act on a wager of an undecidable opacity in the desire of the analysand. This is akin to the political ethical act of Antigone. Both are responding to an almost pathological necessity to address a point of impossible otherness, which is itself seemingly aimed at the beyond, at the das Ding. It is often neglected at the same time that in the ethics seminar, Lacan also opens a very different, literally 180 metapsychological theory to the Kantian antinomy one. In what follows, I want to show that Lacan's theory of the quilting point is tied into a deeper philosophical commitment, which is grounded in a heterodox, utilitarian, and linguistic theory put forward by the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham, specifically his work Theory of Fictions. While Lacan invokes Kant's philosophy to resolve the metapsychological stakes involved with jouissance and the barrier between signifier and jouissance, there is at the same time a theory of how signifier and jouissance achieve a rapport, or put differently, the quilting point is a theory of how jouissance latches or quilts onto the signifier. So these philosophical orientations are working in a kind of tension with one another. And perhaps the most effective example that Lacan gives of what a quilting point is comes in Seminar 3, when he first introduces it. And he says that the signifier fear of God is what quilts the affects during the Middle Ages of subjects engaged in that discourse, right? So the fear of God was the S1, or the master signifier, that completes the sleight of hand, which transforms from 1 minute to the next all fears into perfect courage. All fears, I have no other fears, are exchanged for what is called the fear of God, which, however constraining it may be, actually becomes the opposite of a fear. So a quilting point thus creates a social bond, and when you have a social bond, the antinomic relation between real and symbolic becomes, in a way, locatable. But importantly, the epistemological point is that this quilting is only locatable to the subject as a fiction. This is where Bentham comes into the picture. In Bentham's theory of fictions, Bentham will say that even Rousseau's social contract could only be founded on a fiction. For Bentham, it is fictions that are put in opposition to the real, and fiction is not here to be understood as illusion. Bentham says that tales of apparitions of ghosts and vampires are not more fabulous than what is involved in love relations, or in morality. Both contain the structure of fiction. For Lacan, Bentham had, you could say, an early premonition that it is the pleasure principle that directs man in his or her behavior without his or her knowledge. Bentham therefore defines the fiction of law, because he's addressing this largely to legal scholars, and he argues that law is akin to fictions in that we say something exists which does not exist for the law to have efficacy in society. Therefore, in order for the law to function, we must act as if certain things existed when in fact they don't. And this is how Bentham will also define political values. And the basic reason for Bentham that the fiction is central, why you don't have a kind of nominalist rationalism, is because the nexus of pleasure and pain is more elemental in the way that the subject relates to truth, right? And that means that in a way, Bentham is a kind of early Freudian, recognizing that there's a kind of death drive of enjoyment. There's a disruptive element of enjoyment, right? Thus, Lacan would offer the twist that real enjoyment is only able to be taken up as a fiction itself. In a way, we could say that Lacan completes Bentham's project in the ethics seminar. Okay, so there is an ambiguity here as to how the quilting point is built around structural impossibility. And I want to turn to Zizek's analysis in Zizek's PhD dissertation on Hegel and Lacan, called The Most Sublime Hysteric. He has multiple sections on the idea of quilting point. And he says, quote, the quilting point, far from immediately establishing the totality, embodies its very impossibility. In other words, the quilting point is the only way that the totality can exist as such, and it cannot exist in its full positivity. It rather points to the positivization of a fundamental failure in signification. Therefore, the quilting point can also be called the exceptional one, but exceptional in a paradoxical sense, that it carries the totality as an impossibility. This is also, for those of you that are familiar with Lacanian thought, the paradox of the phallus, right? The phallus is a signifier of its own lack of castration. So there's kind of multiple levels of negation working on the signifier itself. The debate here, however, is whether the symbolic is founded. Now I'm moving here to how the quilting point can be thought as a critique of ideology. And the debate here is whether the socio-symbolic is founded on a rejection of antagonism that makes the social order function, what Marxists would call class struggle. Like there's no way, according to Marxists, that liberals or fascists could ever adequately embrace that real of antagonism, right? It's like that which has to be either foreclosed or covered over, right? Liberalism would foreclose it, and fascism would put the Jew in its place, right? Invent a false fetish, right? Liberalism also creates false fetishes too. We can talk about that. But in a way, the question hinges on rejection, disavowal of an antagonistic point, or whether that antagonistic point can be converted into something that is rationally taken up. It is, in a way, the debate between Kant and Hegel around the knowability of the thing. To take a well-known example, in the case of Nazi fascism, the quilting point is founded on the rejection of the antagonistic basis of society and the kind of containerizing of antagonisms into a false antagonism of the Jew. The Jew covers over the real dimension of the antagonisms. We thus have a very complex movement wherein a fundamental antagonism, class struggle, is concealed by the quilting point of Jew. And of course, this signifier Jew is in a way arbitrary to the social order, and other stand-ins can fill it over. So other social or other societies can quite easily find other stand-in objects, the immigrant, the Muslim, who knows, right? But my question is every ideology founded on a refusal of a more elemental antagonism? And I would argue that every ideology is in fact founded on this maneuver, if we accept the metapsychological point that suggests enjoyment is fundamentally deceptive, and that a quilting point is in fact a point where a minimal irrationalism must be present. Is not liberalism itself ripe with alternative signifiers that are meant to conceal the real dimension of antagonism of our social relations? What is denied by a given ideology as a relevant basis of the social field's true antagonism is what introduces the quilting point. At the same time, for Lacan, a quilting point is what allows a metaphor to work. So the question is the example of the quilting point of Jew the answers for the ills of society, even though it's not an empirically true point? It does not have to be an empirically true point in order for its efficacy to be had, right? Therefore, is every social field structured around a quilting point? Now, in seminar 20 onward, in the late Lacan, he would revise the notion of quilting point. And in this revision of this concept, he identifies a specific historical crisis, what Miller and the Millerians often call the age of the lawless real. And in this way, the concept Lacan derives during this period from about Encore all the way to his death in 1981, are all responding to what I would consider a historical social crisis of the capitalist discourse, right? That is in part animated by Lacan's turn to Marx at a certain point, which happened much earlier. That happens in about the seminar on the theory of the analytic act, from the other to the other, which I think is seminar 11, if I'm not mistaken. But to me, it's obvious that a crisis of quilting point is in fact not new. What do I mean by that? Let's take the example of the university discourse, which existed since the time of Charlemagne. So we have many hundreds of years of the university discourse. What is the university discourse? It is a discourse in which the dispensation of the S1 of what grants agents a kind of performative efficacy within it is the demand to consume knowledge. And of course, Lacan will say that ultimately the problem of the university discourse is that it's a very alienating one, because this subject is deprived of their own singularity as being a part of it. And he makes an interesting point that in the university discourse, it is the name of the scholar that ultimately functions as a kind of hollowed out point in which what is put over it is this kind of drive and repetition for the filling of knowledge. However, has the university discourse not gone through a series of crises over the years? What might a crisis look like, right? So what I would argue is that when this exceptional one, when this quilting point doesn't function, like a good example of a crisis of the university discourse is of course the one that we're going through today. In Australia right now, in philosophy departments, they have not hired a new philosopher for 6 months. There has not been one new hire in the entire country, according to my friends, right? The same thing is written if you look at the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu in his incredible work on the crisis of the university after May 68. You get the very similar thing, which is a kind of policies of austerity create a stifling of the flow of the dispensation of the S1 of the university discourse to actually function like a well-lubed machine, right? So when Lacan says somewhere that a theory of the quilting point is the closest that you can find in his teaching to a theory of historicism, or to a theory of certain mutations in history, I take that to mean that quilting points are extremely important to locate within a given discourse, both as moments of stabilization of its wider network and dispensation, as well as moments of that network's breaking down, right? And I believe that by the time of television, all the way to 1981, Lacan, and of course, it's around the Milan lecture on the capitalist discourse in 1971. From that moment onward, I believe that Lacan is very concerned, tragically concerned, with the acceleration of the discourse of the capitalist. Lacan has a thesis which he says history does not exist. And I think we should interpret this as referring to the way in which there is always this kind of contingent quilting point that structures a logic of history. And you can almost kind of think about Lacanian theory of history as a kind of combination of points, of quilting points. What I'm interested in is understanding a other side of quilting points that might be more rationally thought through. And this is why political epistemology, especially the distinction between nominalist theories of political epistemology and real theories of epistemology interest me so much. In other words, how might we understand the demands that cathected or that quilted the discourse of égalité, liberté, and fraternité out of the French Revolution, or even Lenin's demands in the Bolshevik Revolution of peace, land, and bread? Are we meant to infer that the subjects engaged in those movements related to those quilting points with the fundamental irrationalism or with the fundamental fictional status, right? I don't think that that's true, right? So I think that we need to think a little bit about this relationship between the kind of irrational and rational dimensions. Even a rational quilting point, such as these, however, demands an irrational quilting point that covers over antagonism, according to Zizek, right? So in Zizek's view, a social order can only cohere on condition of some minimal covering over. Like, this is why Zizek is, for me, way too Althusserian when he makes the claim that there is no outside to ideology, right? I think this is a very anti-Hegelian point. I think this is a very strange idea to make this claim, but maybe we can broach that in the Q&A. How am I doing on time here? How much time do I have, William?
You're really at the end here.
Am I at the end? Oh, am I?
Yeah. So how about talk for a couple more minutes?
Couple more minutes.
And then we'll do the questions. Yeah.
All right. So in conclusion, Seminar 18 redefines the Benthamite structure in this idea of the semblant. Now, but it's not only there. In Literatur, which is an incredibly difficult work, which I recommend everybody look at. It's a short but incredibly instructive intervention. Lacan will say that we can think the relationship between enjoyment and language, or the signifier and jouissance, as what he calls a littoral. And a littoral is a topological reference when you're sort of, when you're flying over the ocean and you see a two bodies of water that have a kind of inlet that separates them and their water does not touch, right? That's what Lacan will say is the way that we must think the relationship between, so there's no more, this is why Lacan is in the stage of the non-rapport. So what I'm saying is that the non-rapport of the sexual relation has this metapsychological dimension, which I think is a kind of background animating debate of philosophical significance that Lacan works out. And there's much more that I write, and there's much more that can be said about this, but I think what he's driving towards is a way of trying to think a more rationalist. Like, if Lacan is not a post-structuralist, which I think that we must insist that he's not, that in other words, he's not a kind of Nietzschean brat who just thinks that it's all nothing, all semblance and things is all fictional and so on. No, I think actually Lacan is much more serious, and I think we should be as well. But at the same time, there is a danger, I think, in kind of adopting this, I don't know, like a deconstructionist version of Lacan, and perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A. I'll stop there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah. So questions. Okay, I see. So Wilfried's got a question.
Daniel, you elevate quilting points from a simple idea to a very important idea in Lacan. Are you able to then argue that different cultures have different quilting points, and that one way to compare America with communist countries would be the quilting points, and then much more sensibly the difference between Russian communism and Chinese communism? You would have to discover different quilting points.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's tricky though, in the sense that, it's the same problem that the Bolsheviks faced upon the socialism in one country and the kind of horrors of Stalinism, in the sense that they didn't allow for the real antagonism of the social order to continue to animate and drive the rational kernel of its quilting point, if so to speak, by deprivileging the working class and, bureaucratizing it, right? In Stalinism, yeah, and all of the bureaucratic horrors that came with that. So the strategy would be one, and Lacan says that there's only a couple examples of a discourse that can rationally identify what he calls the semblant, because he really replaces the concept of quilting point with the semblant. And he says that every discourse is of the semblant, right? And even says that, you could have a discourse that's not of semblant, but that would be Jungianism, in the sense that Jungianism would be fine with an absolute rapport between enjoyment and language. And that becomes mythological, right? So if you think of the discourse of Socrates, when Socrates enters the super sensible level of Plato's forms, what's happening to the enjoyment of the philosopher? Do we really want a philosophy that's about subsuming yourself in the forms at the level of your enjoyment? And Lacan says, no. That's why there needs to be a distinction between what the philosopher says and what they write, and why Plato is necessary for Socrates. Otherwise, philosophy would be a mythology and would be demigods, philosopher demigods that speak the truth and magically subsume ourselves in its enjoyment. You see my point? That's why Lacan wants to actually put a halt to the quilting point, in a way, through his introduction of the littoral in his later work. It's a very complex concept. So I hope that makes sense. And of course, other cultures develop their own quilting points. Quilting points are contingent constructions as well. There's a kind of radical contingency, right? So it's even a debate whether the Jacobins' demands, in all of their rational brilliance, for equality and egalitarianism, freedom and liberty, well, because we are subjects of the death drive, in a sense, those also have a threat to be riddled over with an irrationalism, right? So this is the humbling gesture that psychoanalysis gives to emancipatory politics, right? So you have, but it's a tension. And Lacan also says one other thing, I'll stop here. He says that avant-garde art has an awareness for how to keep the semblance and the fiction as a fiction. Like, he believes that, like, the surrealists, and why he was so interested in part of the surrealists, it's because they had a kind of self-aware knowledge of the fictional status in a certain way, which kind of makes sense. Like, they were great. And of course, this is a beautiful way also. Everything I'm saying is a beautiful way for us to understand Lacan's later ethical injunction of the non-duped heir. Because if there's a crisis in the capitalist discourse, it's a crisis over the collapse of signification, the collapse of master signifiers, right? And I was even thinking for Tad's paper too of climate change. Like, it's not adequate to think climate change as, okay, I'll put it this way. How do you think climate change as a master signifier that could order people adequately? It's a real question, like we saw in this movie on Netflix, right? It's a real question. I think Lacan gives us a lot to work with. Sorry, I'm very excited. I'm talking very fast. Oh, Vincenzo's here. Hello, my friend. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Sorry I'm late in joining you.
No problem. Yeah.
So we still have 7 minutes for questions for Daniel, if anybody else has one. Okay, so Wilfried's got another.
Yes, so in your theory, you would be invited to look at the quilting points that are questioned, rebelled against in the American situation of January the 6th. Am I correct?
So I would actually interpret Jan 6th as an example of a crisis of, and the absence of, a quilting point, right? So it's an attempt to respond in an experimental way to a symbolic breakdown in, like, which is why it was so heterogeneous in its organization and in its aesthetics, right? It was itself almost of an avant-garde theater. There was a kind of self-awareness that they were in the spectacle, right? Which is why it became ultimately a social media circus show, and why its violence, to the extent that it was violence, was not planned or intentioned in my view, but was a kind of effect of a sort of chaotic. Because one of the things about the capitalist discourse is the source of the Unbehagen of the capitalist discourse is found in the fact that because the quilting point S1 is deprived to the subject is then left with a surplus enjoyment for which it cannot manage adequately, for which it tries to but struggles to, right? In that way, I see contemporary politics as a kind of ship of fools in which people are trying to exit, trying to get off, but they're kind of overwhelmed by this cycling and the structure of surplus enjoyment, which I don't have time to show. And we could show the matheme, you know, of the capitalist discourse, which I think is very instructive and I think very correct, because it's both of perversion and of psychosis combined, right? It has a little bit of both. And I'm one of the people who thinks that it's one of Lacan's best ideas to describe culture, you know, but others disagree with that, obviously. So I don't know if that answers your question, Wilfried. Hopefully.
Well, it certainly gives new perspective on January 6th.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Does chaos follow when there's no quilting point? I mean, that might be an overly simplistic way to put it, but that's kind of what it felt like.
I honestly
think
it's a way of talking about two categories. One would be Marxist and one would be Nietzschean. The Marxist one would be decadence. I'm thinking here of Lukács. When the bourgeois order undergoes irrationalism, what that means is the dispensation of its signification potential is lost, right? Like, not only are the class of liberal commentariats perceived by the majority of people as pathetic and so on, that to me is clear, but there's a deeper structure that is affecting all subjects within the culture. And I think that Lacan's thesis of the capitalist discourse sort of arrives at that. And then the other one would be nihilism, because nihilism would be the stunting of, because what this also is about is the master signifier is no longer in the measure of the subject. That's why the capitalist discourse is also a theory of alienation, because the structure of meaning as what is produced is always already captured by commodified logics. And a good example of that is what we're experiencing now with the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the struggles that the movement is finding in becoming commodified, right? Where it's quite easy for the co-optation of liberatory master signifiers to become hollowed out by capitalist discourse, right? So there's another way to kind of think about it.
Interesting. All right. Okay, so we can stop there with Daniel. Is that okay? Oh, then Vincenzo, do you have quick? Yeah, one more, because we still have 1 minute.
I'm a very quick gloss. I'm really sorry I didn't get the brunt, the majority of Daniel's presentation, but I think I followed the core of his argument. It's a very small gloss. I want to say two things. One is, as a clinician, I did a Lacanian analysis myself and have very intimately aware of Lacan's thinking. And I've always been impressed with the quilting point. So, and the other one is as a philosophical political commentary. I think my clinical intuition is that people are afraid, even terrified, when they perceive a lack of a quilting point, especially in the other. And I think this is why January 6th was so provocative. You know, I read David Remnick in the New York Times. I read even Francis Fukuyama. I mean, I'm reading a wide swath of people, including here in Brazil. There's a very important leftist review called Piauí, very, very brilliant take on George Floyd and asphyxia and related to Francois Fanon's thought from a very different perspective. But in the Anglo-American world, in all the reviews I've read about it, there's a sense of terror. And as a result, it's a void that they want to fill in with all kinds of conspiracy theories. I think Daniel has got it absolutely right. It was like feedback. It was a runaway phenomenon that became bigger than anyone could possibly have planned. I'm not justifying anyway. I'm just saying that there was something very, as he said, avant-garde about it. So that's my clinical insight. My political instinct about this, and my political analysis is that because people don't tolerate this void, they're looking for quilting points, and they're imposing quilting points in a way that I think is probably misguided, wrong-headed, and they're gonna come out with people who are les coupables, you know, the guilty at any price, so that the larger public discourse can calm down, have its, you know, a pound of meat, and then relax. And I think that's a mistake. I think it both exaggerates and trivializes the real threat that it represented. So those are my two thoughts. As a clinician, I believe that people do not tolerate voids. And I think the brilliance of the quilting point is that it grasps a fundamental insight into the nature of psychosis, and why I think people, including, I'm a psychiatrist, including people in my field, are so scared of psychosis and trauma. So I think that's a brilliant thing. And I think the political part is we're imposing something that exaggerates it and misses its true meaning. This kind of runaway, this feedback thing, like, you know, a microphone and an amplifier. And I think body politic, notably in the United States, can't tolerate that idea. They have to find someone who's guilty. They have to have someone to lynch or to be responsible. And I'm not saying I'm justifying it anyway. I'm just saying that that's a wrong-headed approach, and I think it's very much related to the quilting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's interesting that you can have after 9/11 like a kind of liberal demand of tolerance of the neighbor emerge as a positive quilting point. But I think in the Trump period, it is true that we haven't seen a kind of example. Like, why? Because I think to the extent that we need a quilting point to patch over the real, to patch over antagonism, which goes back to the political epistemology, it's too brutal to identify. Like, this is precisely why Sanders, even in 2015, before Trump came into the picture, was being identified by the Washington Post as uncivil, right? Why was he being, and he's not talking about trying to introduce a quilting point. No, I think the socialist vision would be to, and that's the proletarian position, because the proletarian position is also excluded from the quilting point, I would argue. And that's a whole other section of my paper, but I know we should stop. So
thank you.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting though. Okay, so Wilfried, you are up. So this is Wilfried Verecki from Georgetown, and the paper is Hegel, Lacan, and is Tienari a name? Tienari contra the American Psychiatric Association.
Yes. In DSM-5-TR, the latest diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders from the American Psychiatric Association, we find the following statement about paranoid personality disorder. Quote, genetic and physiological. There is some evidence for an increased prevalence of paranoid personality disorder in relatives or probants with schizophrenia, and for a more specific relationship with delusional disorder persecutory type, page 651. DSM-5-TR claims a similar genetic or biological cause for another severe mental illness, schizophrenia. In DSM-5-TR, we find the following statement about schizophrenia. Quote, there is a strong contribution for genetic factors in determining risks for schizophrenia, although most individuals who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia have no family history of psychosis, page 103. In this statement, we have a claim for genetic causality and a report of facts which contradicts the claim, i.e., there is no family history of psychosis. In the passage, The Law of the Heart, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel provides an argument to demonstrate that paranoia is the logical consequence of a defective position of the mind. Hegel thereby contradicts the position of the American Psychiatric Association about the nature of paranoia. Building upon the ideas of Hegel, Lacan then goes a step further and points out that Hegel's analysis rests on the observation that a future paranoid, while still a romantic reformer, believes that his or her desires are the same as those of all other people. Lacan then analyzes where the belief of the future paranoid comes from, that all human beings have the same desire as he or she has. We will start by presenting the ideas of Hegel, and then in a second part present the ideas of Lacan. At the end of my paper, I will present the results of a Finnish researcher, Tienari, demonstrating that the psychological environment dominates whatever biological predistributions there might be for severe mental illness. Tienari provides the scientific evidence for the argument made by Hegel that severe mental illness, like paranoia, is the result of a defect in the position taken by the mind. Part 1, Hegel on how the romantic reformer must become paranoid. Section 1, the romantic reformer's experience of making the law conform to its own heart. The project of the romantic reformer is to change the law, which is indifferent or even opposed to the heart of individuals, in a law that conforms to her individual heart, and it is presumed that her heart is like the heart of all individuals. The romantic reformer must therefore propose a new ordinance, a new law that is to replace the old law. When the new proposal is enacted, it becomes law. But a characteristic of enacted law is that it is impersonal. An essential characteristic of the heart is that it insists on being treated for its own sake and in terms of its individuality. An objective way in which this difference manifests itself is that the law tends to be unchangeable, whereas the heart is alive and constantly changes its desires. So the successful romantic reformer discovers that her intended project becomes something other than what she intended. she discovers that her very project in succeeding fails. Quote, the heart of the law, through its very realization, ceases to be a law of the heart. Hegel, page 223. Nevertheless, something has been achieved. The new law is not equal to the old law. It cannot be treated as an alien law which has to be changed. The new law is the product of the romantic reformer and is thus her law. The romantic reformer has thus irrevocably gotten involved in the law. Quote, what he brings about is merely the entanglement of himself in the actual ordinance, an entanglement in it, moreover, not as a superior power, which is only alien to him, but one which is hostile. End of quote, Hegel, page 223. The romantic reformer, because of her successful opposition to the old law, discovers that she is the originator of a new product, the new law, in which she cannot recognize herself. Worse, the romantic reformer discovers that she is the originator of a product that has two characteristics. On the one hand, the new law is an essential aspiration of her consciousness. On the other, it is an unacceptable product. The romantic reformer now experiences opposition not to an alien law, but to a law she created. The romantic reformer thus finds herself opposed to her own essential identity as reformer and thus maker of a law. In this way, the romantic reformer becomes divided against herself. The sole reason for this turn of events is the romantic reformer's misunderstanding of the law. The romantic reformer understands the legitimate function of the law to be nothing but the expression of the individual heart. It is, however, the function of the law to be universal and thus impersonal. The law allows for this misunderstanding because the law in its universality elevates some particular determination to law. The illusion of the romantic reformer consists of the belief that a particular content is all there is in the law. The romantic reformer does not understand that a particular content of the law is always represented as universal and thus impersonal. Section 2, the romantic reformer's experience of her expected role as the savior of mankind. It is the reformer's hope that replacing the content of the law with a new content, borrowed from the personal wishes of the romantic reformer herself, will lead to her reconciliation with the new law and also the reconciliation of all human beings with that same law, because the romantic reformer believes that the wishes of her heart are the same as the wishes of every heart. Thus, the romantic reformer sees herself as an instrument of reconciliation for the law and all people. The romantic reformer's method does not address the form of the law, but only the content of the law. That oversight leads to her first negative experience. With reference to the content of the law, the romantic reformer is certain that replacing the existing content with a different and better content will solve the alienating function of the law. She further believes that all she needs to do is replace the current content of the law with content in line with her own heart's wishes. She believes this because she is subjectively convinced that there is no difference between her heart and the hearts of all other people. However, in making her preference the law of the heart, the romantic reformer experiences opposition and dissatisfaction with this new law by many others. She thus discovers that she was mistaken in the belief that her wishes were universal. By making her personal preferences law, the romantic reformer does not liberate other people. Rather, she imposes her wishes on them. The others now discover 3 reasons for opposing the romantic reformer. First, they might dislike the new law more than the old law and might therefore consider the new law worse than the old regime. Second, the others might accept the idea that the new law is an improvement, but if the others have the same conviction as the romantic reformer, they cannot be satisfied with improvement. Third, there might be a subtler reason for others' disappointment in the legal reform of the romantic reformer. Even if others like the content of the new law as presented by the romantic reformers, these others will experience the law-like form of the new law and therefore not experience any reconciliation with the new law. The new law will remain a law. The promise of reconciliation was always an impossible promise that necessarily disappoints. I take Hegel to concentrate on the second reason for others to oppose the successful romantic reformer. The romantic reformer incorporates her preferences into the new law and naively expects that everyone else will be reconciled with the new law, as she falsely believes that her heart is the norm for all hearts. The romantic reformer actually believed that in imposing her preference on others, she would be loved by them for bringing about reconciliation with law. Instead, the others are fully justified in opposing the romantic reformer because she uses the force of the law to impose her preferences on them. 2 things now happen to the romantic reformer. First, instead of a cold law that opposes her heart's desires, she now has to deal with warm bodies that oppose her reform movement. Quote, thus just as the individual at first finds only the rigid law, now he finds the hearts of men themselves opposed to his excellent intentions and detestable. Hegel, page 224. Second, instead of being a messiah, she finds herself recast as the enemy of the people. Quote, he finds the heart of men themselves opposed to his excellent intentions. Hegel 224. These 2 experiences alienate the romantic reformer from other human beings. She is alienated from other human beings inasmuch as they are entangled themselves in the law. Third section, total experience of the romantic reformer. The romantic reformer becomes entangled in a contradictory experience of the law and is rejected by her co-citizens. The latter experience will force the romantic reformer to become a lonely, isolated figure. Hegel seems to consider this experience to be a result and thus concentrates in analysis upon the contradictory experience of the law. For Hegel, the law transcends the individual and thus demands from the individual a commitment or a surrender. The law as universal is an objective reality that is able to give existence to individual life. The romantic reformer does not understand and is unable to accept the transcendence of the law. This deficiency in the romantic reformer's understanding is responsible for her contradictory experience of the law and thus of herself. On the one hand, the romantic reformer feels and understands that the law is so important that she can make the enactment of a proper law the essence of her existence. On the other hand, the romantic reformer does not understand the transcendence of the law and furthermore cannot tolerate the distance between the transcendent law and her heart. The romantic reformer must therefore experience any law, even the law she enacted as contrary to her deepest aspirations. The romantic reformer is thus a consciousness that experiences the law as both its own essence and the denial of its essence. The romantic reformer has these two experiences in two distinct time periods. At first, time separates these two distinct experiences. However, consciousness is time consciousness. Time is therefore not capable of permanently separating the two contradictory experiences of the law. When the romantic reformer realizes that it aims at the law as its essence, why it considers any law necessarily as denial of its essence, then the romantic reformer has the experience of its own essential contradiction. Hegel calls this experience the perversion or craziness of this form of consciousness. The romantic reformer's attempt to deal with its own experienced craziness. What is left for the romantic reformer who experiences her own craziness? Such a consciousness needs to avoid its self-destruction. However, as it in fact crazy, it cannot succeed only by some process of denial. It must read its own craziness as something other than what it is. The romantic reformer is a consciousness that structurally sees no difference between itself and others. It is therefore natural that it discovers and projects its own perversion and craziness onto others. This strategy allows the disappointed romantic reformer to make sense of its secondary disappointment, the opposition by others to its social reform movement. It also allows her to express her opinion about the law. The disappointed social reformer now becomes a person who accuses her opponents of being perverts who use a perverted law for their own interests. In turn, this perverted law deprives millions of the happiness that a perfect law would be able to bring to the masses who now suffer in misery. The romantic reformer hereby preserves in her own eyes her essential goodness and her narcissistic goal of being a savior to the suffering masses. Her goodness and the happiness of the masses still rest on her faulty understanding of the function of the law. Public law should be the expression of the wishes of individuals. Only now does the romantic reformer need to replace her noble project of legal reform with paranoid accusations against her opponents. Part 2, Lacan. Lacan addresses explicitly one point in Hegel's analysis, i.e., the belief that the romantic reformer, by the romantic reformer, that his heart is the same as the heart of everybody. In other words, the romantic reformer has not integrated in his psychic thinking the idea that others might be different from himself, that others might have different desires and different ideas about what they consider the good society. Lacan connects this inability to feel that others might be different to a defective child development, in particular, a defective relationship to their siblings. Lacan's theoretical move consists in showing how an exaggerated imaginary identification with the alter ego, the other who is the same, the sibling, inevitably leads to paranoia. Among siblings, one observes normally two moments. They imitate and they compete. The moment of imitation indicates that the other sibling represents an ideal worth borrowing from. The first sibling is the ideal for the second. The competition, the rivalry between siblings, represents a total different moment. It is a moment of separation from the other who represents one's ideal, and also an awareness that such idealizing imitation can be alienating. Entering competition with another sibling means that the second sibling separates herself from the one in whom she located her ideal. She also affirms that her exterior image is not her whole self. However, doing so means that this sibling might discover that she is naked, that she is robbed of her ideal, which is located in the other sibling. It requires the competing sibling to face the uncertainty of not feeling who she is. She is then invited to start the process of individuation. Lack of a competition with the sibling must therefore be interpreted as failure of individuation. The sibling who failed to compete with the other siblings must experience competition as dangerous because it exposes her as naked, as worthless. As aggression is a crucial component of competition, that aggression becomes dangerous. The non-competing sibling has access to a temporary solution, but she also has a permanent problem. The temporary solution for the non-competing sibling is to create a dual union with a sibling who represents her ideal, the ideal that she is unable to assume for herself. Thus, the first sibling becomes that what a second sibling lacks. For the second sibling, the first sibling is more me than I am myself. The non-competing sibling must fear her own aggression because it separates and thus initiates individuation. Aggression must be repressed and thus goes underground. The establishment of a dual union with a sibling and the repression of aggression to avoid the problem of individuation are neither permanent nor stable solutions. Aggression needs to find an object. Such an object cannot be an immediate love object, because that would again pose the unsolvable problem of aggressive competition. Instead, the paranoid starts a process of rationalizing by creating an illusionary utopian world without competition. The paranoid envisions her happiness in such a world. In the meantime, the paranoid will search the ideal models that are somewhat out of reach, actresses, authors. These she can either love or hate. She can try to imitate or hatefully accuse these models, or she may alternate between the two attitudes. Lacan now speculates that if a paranoid is integrated into a utopian society where is mutual support and active improvement of the world, she can survive the rest of her life with a paranoid style. If the paranoid does not have the benefit of a utopian society, she will be confronted with her lack of individuation. Her lack of individuation consists in the fact that she endows others with her ideals. The others are therefore, in her eyes, entitled to invade her. She gives others unconscious permission to crush her. The others have that role because they possess the ideal that she lacks herself. The logic allows us to understand Aimé's hate-love relationship towards her idols. As those idols represents her ideal, she will try to imitate. She even writes 2 novels as those ideals did. When her manuscript is rejected, she is again confronted with the affirmation that she is not measuring up to the ideal that others represent. She then attacked first the executive of the publishing house that rejected her manuscript, later one of the people she idealized. Lacan's interpretation of the paranoid does not relate paranoia to homosexuality. It is thus a different theory than Freud's. As proof of his theory, Lacan cites the clinical fact that the paranoiac tolerates rather well a homosexualized nearness of the same as other. Indeed, Aimé tolerates well the nearness of her sister. The presence of such another as same has even salutary effects. There is, of course, a generally recognized homosexual component in the paranoid, which Lacan points to as being a consequence, not a cause of the entire affair. The paranoid experiences the principle of sexual difference as creating disorder in human relations. Therefore, the paranoid retreats to an asexual ego image. Rather than being an attempt to actually have homosexual relations with another, it is a denial of sexual difference. Tienari's ideas. Tienari and his group started by taking an inventory of all women in Finland who had been hospitalized for schizophrenia or paranoid psychosis for 20-year periods from January 1, 1960 through 1979. The study then looked for all these women who had children given up for adoption before age 4 to non-relatives in Finland. The study then analyzed the psychological quality of the adoptive families and divided them into 4 groups. First, healthy families. Second, families judged to be neurotic. Third, families diagnosed with personality disorders. And fourth, families judged to have functional psychosis. Tienari and his colleagues report that 0 children of psychotic mothers developed a functional psychosis if the adopting family was classified as healthy. The study of Tienari thus provides the scientific evidence that genetics does not explain the known facts. Hegel and Lacan go a step further than Tienari by providing a psychological explanation for severe mental illnesses like paranoia. Conclusion. Both Hegel and Lacan observed that the psychic structure of the paranoid person includes an inability to feel that other persons are different. Both note that a paranoid person at some point has a utopian dream of transforming society for the better. They both also observe the explosion of aggression at some point in the paranoid person. Hegel, benefiting from Schiller's artistic description of Karl Moore, is able to provide a dialectic connection between these different features in the life of the paranoia. Lacan is able to go a step further because he can explore the life of a real paranoid by analyzing one point in her childhood. Indeed, whereas children normally both identify and thus idealize a sibling and fight with siblings, Aimé, Lacan's paranoid patient, only identified and idealized her sister. Lacan then points out that fighting with an idealized sibling is a risky business because it creates a separation of one's own ideal projected into that sibling. In fighting an idealized sibling, so Lacan argues, the fighting sibling might find psychologically naked, that is, not enriched by an ideal. It is true that this experience of psychological nakedness then becomes an invitation to create one's own ideal, provided one can tolerate this psychological nakedness. The paranoid was not able to face such psychological nakedness and thus avoided and repressed the aggression that could cause it. Contrary to American psychiatry, we have been able to argue that paranoia, a severe mental illness, is not the result of genetic or biological causes, but it is the result of a defective position taken by the mind, which is the position taken by Hegel in his ideas developed in the passage of his phenomenology called the law of the heart. That defective position taken by the mind is the result of a defective psychological development of the child. Here, Tienari and Lacan confirm each other. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So it's 9:02, so I think we can go till 9:15 with questions for Professor Eecke. Any questions for Wilfried? Daniel?
I'm wondering, is your treatment of Hegel's idea of the romantic reformer from the phenomenology something that Lacan references in his analysis of Aimé? Is that
yes?
So? But I guess my question is, you have isolated it as maybe like the way to unlock Lacan's theory of paranoid psychosis in this very famous case, and also a way that Lacan made his name by putting forward a radically different theory of the way that the ideals function there, and then that will be then later generalized as a wider critique of ideals as such. So do you think the scholarship has missed the centrality of this relatively obscure reference to Hegel? Do you think that has gone unacknowledged by Lacanian scholars?
Well, yeah, that I do not know, but there is a big awareness that in the beginning of his career, Lacan was studying Hegel, and there is even a discussion that is published between Lacan and the Hegel scholar Hippolyte about the role of negation. So in the beginning of his career, he was making use a lot of Hegel, and Lacan was therefore not different from Lévi-Strauss, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, who all followed in the 1930s the lectures of Kojève, where over 6-year period, Kojève commented about the whole of Hegel's phenomenology. Thus, the intellectuals of France from the 60s are all very deeply influenced by Kojève's reading of Hegel's phenomenology. It might be a one-sided reading, but it is a reading that elevated the master-slave dialectic to the center of Hegel's thinking.
But Kojève does not emphasize the romantic reformer too much.
No. The romantic reformer, that is not stressed by Kojève.
Right.
But Lacan, I do not know from where Lacan got that passage of the law of the heart that he so explicitly comments on.
Well, it's in the phenomenology, no?
Yeah, but still, he must then have learned the whole of the phenomenology.
Yeah,
the
very few
master-slave
people comment
dialectic,
on it. Right.
The master-slave dialectic is the crucial one.
Well,
yeah,
that's how Lacan reads text, though. He always finds something in classical text that we haven't found before.
Yeah.
He never goes to the main passage. It's always some marginal thing
I
that's
see. Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah.
Unmuting myself. Wilfried, would you say in general that Lacan basically, under the influence of Kojève's reading, distrusts Hegel's dialectic as a way of metaphysically closing the gap? So that what you're saying today, giving Lacan and Hegel a kind of solidarity against the American psychiatric assessment of paranoia as genetic and so on, are you basically kind of bringing Lacan and Hegel together in a way that Lacan himself might not have recognized?
Well, he did not defend a genetic dimension of mental illness. He always went in the direction of a psychological explanation of mental illnesses. And that is radically new.
Yes, yeah, no, that I understand. I was asking about how you assess, because I know you're both a Lacan scholar and a scholar of Hegel, and I just wonder if you would even agree with this idea that Hegel, for Lacan, he's always holding Hegel at, to some extent, is invoking him and values him, but he's holding him at arm's length because he distrusts the Hegelian dialectic as promoting a kind of metaphysical closure that Lacan himself doesn't accept. Would you?
Yes.
Right. And
if you look at the whole life of Lacan, Hegel is only one of the many figures from whom he borrowed ideas, like de Saussure, and then Wittgenstein, and so on. So he is not accepting the whole of the ideas of any of the thinkers that he borrows from. He borrows parts that he then uses for his own explanation. And it is difficult to imagine that without Hegel, you could get a psychological explanation for paranoia. And so that is what he does. At the same time, his linguistic dimension started by borrowing from de Saussure. And then he turns it around within his system. And in this case, he went even further. He concentrated on one point in Hegel's analysis. The romantic reformer believes that his heart is the same as the heart of the others. And Lacan is focusing on that and trying to find an explanation why that is the case. And thereby then give an even deeper explanation of the journey of the person of the romantic reformer. But he does not feel obliged to accept the implications of a passage taken from an author like Hegel, or a passage taken from Wittgenstein, or from de Saussure. So that is my sense.
So I have a quick clarification question. When you say paranoid, do you mean that as synonymous with schizophrenic, or is this no?
No. So a paranoid is someone who accuses the other. A schizophrenic person is someone who imagines an alternative world in which the desires that are not satisfied in the real world are satisfied in the delusion. Thus, Judge Schreber was a very successful lawyer. He became the president of the second highest court under Bismarck, Germany, but he had a desire. He wanted to have children, and his wife had had 5 or 6 miscarriages. So at that point, he felt he could not have his basic desires satisfied. One way to deal with that is mourning. He seemed not to have been able to mourn. Instead, he started fantasizing that God made him a woman so that God could marry him and create a new mankind where he would be the patron saint. So a schizophrenic creates an alternative world where the unsatisfied desire is oversatisfied. Whereas the paranoid is someone who is aggressive against other people, imagines that the others are against them.
But both are forms of psychosis where they're sort of
if it is severe enough, both can be classified as. If it is light, you would not classify it as. But if it are severe, yes.
And when Tienari said talked about the healthy families, did he just mean healthy in this? What did he mean by healthy? I'm trying to make sure my children.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, there is a psychological study, healthy children, a little bit less, a healthy family, a little bit less, and so on. And he followed the characteristics that were developed by other psychologists. And he with his team then made questions and analyzed different families according to different things. Now, the only secondary phenomenon that I found was that the children of psychotic mothers had a little bit more psychiatric problems. But notice they could have been with the psychotic mother up to 4 months.
Right.
They could have
yeah,
already
environment.
been
Yeah.
very much influenced, but that even after 4 months, when they were given to a normal family, not one became schizophrenic.
It is interesting. I sometimes worry about this raising, you know, you see, it's sad, the homeless population, I mean, every major city, the mental illness, psychosis rates are so high, and you wonder how it happened. And then, you know, you start worrying about your own kids, and could it just happen like just a physical thing? It just born that way. Can I control this in any way? You know, that's what's good. That's what goes through my mind.
Well, the Lacanian argument corrected by my own professor Vergote is simply the following. That is, the children, when they are born, are totally dependent from another, normally the mother figure. But as soon as they become aware, that is intolerable. As a consequence, the child creates two fantasies. My mother is omnipotent and perfect, otherwise I am not safe. Number two, I am everything that my mother could want, therefore she will take care of me. That fantasy is part of children. I noticed with my children, we came back from Germany where we had been for a year and a half, and on the breakfast table, my wife read in the newspaper that there were few children in Germany. One of my children, 5 years old or so, said, well, why so few children? And my wife gave a common sense answer, I guess. She said, I guess those German parents think it's too much work. To which my child said, but do those German parents not know it are the children who do all the work?
Mm.
Then the sibling rivalry emerged, and the older daughter said, this is the most stupid thing I have ever heard. Don't you know, it's only in this family that the children do everything. So that was 2 knocks.
That's pretty good. Okay. All right. So thank you. That was great. And so it's Tad's turn. So this is Tad DeLay, Baltimore City Community College, and the paper is called Dueling, Negations in the Ecological Crisis.
Thank you. Yeah. And this will be a bit shorter, actually. I was aiming more for 20 minutes or so, so we'll close out with that. In his 1925 essay, Negation, Freud makes this offhand observation that helps me make sense of our sort of lumbering response to the climate crisis. Freud said his analysans, when repression starts to fail, wander down one of 2 paths of negation or denial. So what do they do? Well, first, there's this analysand who negates reality as such, you know, gets bugged by some idea presenting itself to him and can't accept it. So he simply rejects the interpretations, denies events actually happened, and so on. Reality denial, pure and simple. And this is actually the denial of Dasting that we discussed earlier. But Freud says that there's this other type of negation in which the subject essentially rejects the attribute which is morally threatening, accepts reality, but says it's not their fault. So when repression begins to fail, one mode of denial rejects, or one mode of denial or negation rejects reality altogether, while another accepts reality, but rejects the moral blame or guilt for that reality. So this observation has helped me work through the climate change denial for a forthcoming book that I'm publishing with Verso under the working title Denial Futures, from which this paper is derived. I'm not so much interested here tonight in reality rejection. I consider critiques of conservatives rejecting science to be pretty low-hanging fruit, to be honest. What I'm interested more is a conversion symptom of capitalism. Capitalism strives to continue extracting fossil fuels worth $250 quadrillion out of the ground, consequences be damned, then it needs all kinds of moral negation covering for it. Perhaps it needs two political parties, one locked into reality denial and another which distances itself from blame by pretending to act. Perhaps capitalism offers you an offset so that, for instance, Delta Airlines now pretends to be carbon neutral and such nonsense like that. Or maybe capitalism promises to be carbon neutral by 2050. In short, this age of denial is not over, as we are often told. No, denial is just getting started, and we who know something of the death drive might have something to add to that. But first, a story of denial as a conversion symptom. You're not from around here, are you? A vigilante is barking this question at the occupants of a vehicle he has stopped on a small road in the Pacific Northwest. It was autumn 2020. Fires stretching the West Coast painted the skies a burnt orange. In various places, the hue at noon was blood red. 5 of the 10 largest wildfires in Californian history burned simultaneously. Nobody alive has witnessed such ruin. It had not been so hot since the Eemian interglacial period, some 130,000 years ago, when temperatures averaged just a degree warmer, driving our ancestors out of Africa, while seas rose a meter every 20 years for several centuries. Between the origins of agriculture along the Tigris and Euphrates to the invention of hydraulic fracking, indeed in the entire history of civilization after we left the cave, it has never been so hot. But paleoclimate data is not on the mind of the vigilante barking, "You're not from around here, are you?" He was armed. He was pointing his question at an African-American mother fleeing wildfires. She registered the racial overtones in the Inquisition. This mother was stopped at an improvised checkpoint in Corbett, Oregon. Fires threatened the community around Portland, Oregon, an overwhelmingly white area of the Pacific Northwest. Evacuees take to the road. It was the year of the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, at least. Just after the summer of mass protests for racial justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder by police, an election approach, the incumbent praises violence, police assault countless citizens, over 100 reactionaries rammed protesters with vehicles. Conservative legislatures rushed through bills to authorize this manslaughter tactic of running over protesters. Hundreds of thousands die of a virus. America is about to erupt, wallowing in a desire for what? Not a desire to know anything. You're not from around here, are you? So back to this illegal checkpoint. The vigilante's eyes dart from the African-American mother to the other occupants, scanning the vehicle and gauging threats. In the back, her young children stare back at the vigilante and the rifle with which he might dispatch them. No, he decides these are not his targets. He is searching for arsonists, saboteurs, the right hallucinated fixation of late, Antifa. Elsewhere, in a nearby town, a journalist is accosted and flees. As he speeds away, a truck intercepts from the front, blocking the highway. Out of the vehicle emerges another gunman, aiming his rifle through the journalist's windshield. Further down, a few miles southwest in another town, 3 journalists are stopped at gunpoint at an improvised checkpoint, guns raised. A vigilante snapped, "Get the fuck out of here," as he took photos of their faces and license plate. One member of a local Facebook group organizing the counterattack suggests they fight back, writing, quote, "Most of us can mobilize and bring our arsenal with us." The radio literally reports Antifa shooting at firefighters trying to put out the fires. Police are alerted to the illegal vigilante checkpoints, but will not intervene. A school board member organizes citizens' patrols, and a sheriff's sergeant asks for photos of cars and even license plates. The sheriff's sergeant advises vigilantes to keep an eye out for, quote, "anything that feels out of place to you. Just listen to your gut, because 9 times out of 10, your gut is right." Interesting statement from a psychoanalytic perspective here. A Clackamas County Sheriff's deputy was forced out of his job after a video goes viral in which he erupts at imaginary culprits. In the video, he whines, quote, "What I'm worried about is that there's people stashing stuff. It means they're going to go in preparation. And I don't want to sound like some doomsayer, but it's getting serious. And we need the public's help on this." In the video of this incident, another cop interjects to say that the people around Portland will simply stay home and die in the inferno rather than risk evacuating only to encounter anarchist or Antifa. The deputy blurts out, Antifa motherfuckers, okay, are causing hell. And there's a lot of lives at stake. And there's a lot of people's property at stake because these guys got some vendetta, end of quote. The next day, also on camera, this same deputy advises a citizens group that they must be cautious when using deadly force. When they kill outsiders, he told them, the courts will demand an explanation. He laughs with them, charming these bloodthirsty piglets. He explains, quote, "Now you throw a fucking knife in their hand. After you shoot them, that's on you." More laughter from the crowd. He assures them, quote, "I am on your side, people. I am 100%. I wouldn't let this shit happen in my neighborhood either, but be smart about it." So over a weekend in September 2020, illegal checkpoints on the roads and armed squads spring up independently in at least 3 towns near Portland, Oregon. Fueled on social media rumors and encouraged by police, citizens organically convert latent climate denial in the middle of a wildfire during a highly aggravated political environment, scouting instead for imaginary leftists while pointing weapons, in fact, at reporters and African-American families. So thankfully, there's no reports of lethal violence this time, a near miss. You're not from around here, are you? So how do we make sense of such symptoms ever more foolish and violent? In Freud's analysis of negation, the patient offered up something like, he gives one example, you ask who this person is in a dream, it's not my mother, which Freud then interprets, so it is his mother. So this is the first formulation of denial, and amending the statement to an opposite was only the simplest example. Continuing from there, Freud was trying to parse the repressed ideas from the types of denial taken when the repressed becomes conscious. So he explores a few more examples. It's clear he's trying to figure out exactly what happens right in that liminal space when the unconscious is becoming conscious, but not in a good way, right? What's turning up is unpleasant to the analysand, so they must negate it. So the order is first a repression, second, the repression starts to falter, which then generates a need to negate whatever threatens to become conscious. In another example, a neurotic approaches Freud and says, I've got this new obsessive idea. It occurred to me that, that it might mean so-and-so, but no, that can't be true, or it wouldn't have occurred to me. So here Freud says we have the basic structure of a denial. The repressed idea becomes conscious, then the idea is negation. And then Freud says the negation attests to the truth of the repudiated idea. Thus, Freud arrives at his formula for negation, quote, negation is a way of taking cognizance of what is repressed. Indeed, it is already a lifting of the repression, though not, of course, an acceptance of what is repressed, end of quote. So the affect and the idea split, allowing the affective component to remain repressed, even as the patient consciously acknowledges the idea, at least for a moment. So we're constantly bumping up against repressed material without a way to flex or dynamically respond. If we were doing that without a way to respond, our mental world would feel like a prison. Splitting the affect from the idea through negation allows a bit of leeway, which is what the negative judgment does. So to judge and act negatively is akin to deciding, this is something I would prefer to repress. So when forming judgments, Freud, and this comes back to where I started off, when forming judgments, Freud saw 2 categories. First, there's a judgment or a negation, a denial that asserts or disputes that a presentation has an existence in reality. Or second, there's a judgment or a negation or denial that affirms or disaffirms the possession of a thing, of a particular moral attribute of a thing. Freud describes the second rejection judgment as moral in nature. So there we have it, two negating judgments. Again, one negates reality itself, while the other negates one's moral culpability or sense of guilt, but each signifies some sort of repression that's failing. Climate denial broadly construed here, not just the overt, like the science is fake, but all of the ways that we respond in order to sort of distance ourselves from the crisis. Climate denial broadly construed is rife with negation. Liberals tend towards the rejection of moral culpability, while conservatives more commonly reject reality. But the truth is that we are now awash in so many options for negation, it becomes difficult to separate out the idea or the denial from the legitimate mitigation. So while classic reality denial still hammers hard on old myths about deceptive scientists, or like, you know, there's this thing with the 12-year sun cycle or whatever else, moral denial asks for something different. Moral denial asks for like carbon offsets or hybrid cars or local purchasing or recycling and so on. And that's not to say that all these behaviors to lower my guilt over the environmental impact are foolish. Certainly lowering my carbon contribution is in some absolute sense a postponement of apocalypse, but it's important to realize that true climate mitigation, actual solutions, on the one hand, and false greenwashing are happening parallel to our efforts to morally distance ourselves from the crisis. Okay, so hopefully that theoretical component makes sense. I'm going to go. So when I speak of conversions or moral distancing negations, what do I mean? Okay, I'm going to go through 10 very rapid fire examples here for a moment. First example, Greece announces it will build nets in the Aegean Sea. There are too many Syrians pouring into its borders. They must be drowned, no matter if they are fleeing a war triggered by a drought induced by a warmer climate. Second example, drone strikes hit cities on the aridity line winding through the Sahel and Middle East. Yes, if you trace where we send our drones, it's almost without exception to places on the aridity line where there's just barely enough annual rainfall for growing food. So the United States and its allies currently carry out drone strikes along the aridity line winding through Mali, Libya, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Niger, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. European policies of externalizing borders redirect northbound African migrants eastward into neighboring states, hoping they get bogged down in the Sahara and remain in Africa. Heat-stressed and drought-stricken areas pack tighter still. Some rebel. Those who do rebel are labeled terrorists and slated for termination. All for a lack of rainfall on an aridity line that is, thanks to warming, moving year by year. So Western states are viewing themselves as fighting terrorism without realizing that they are literally already engaged in the early water wars. Okay, third example. In 2018, during the worst drought in decades, a migrant caravan in the Northern Triangle tracks north to the southern border of the United States. They wish to claim asylum. Trump and right-wing media accuse the migrants of harboring Middle Easterners or Islamic State terrorists, which is clearly just a pretext for violence and barbarism against climate migrants. Fourth example, the United Nations requests states consider claims of asylum related to climate change, but creates no legal category for climate migrant or climate refugee, even though such refugees now outnumber war refugees as many as 10 to 1. Fifth example, billionaire Bill Gates begins testing equipment to unilaterally fill the sky with aerosols to deflect sunlight, a step towards geoengineering, which is illegal for states under international law. He says if the world is saved, there's a good chance it will be through a technology he funded. And as proof of his authenticity, he boasts of buying, not making this up, he boasts of buying sustainable jet fuel for his private jet. Sixth, in 2020, Tesla reports profits for the first time since its founding in 2003, raking a profit of $721 million. But it was only in the black because it made $1.6 billion in revenue from selling carbon credits. So you imagine you buy a Tesla, of course, to lower emissions, and you do lower your emissions on a long enough timeline. But the truth is you lower your emissions while somebody else gets to pollute more, right? So Elon Musk continues to cultivate this image of a savior while carrying on grifts and graft and nonsense and so forth. Seventh example, murderers of environmentalists reach new heights worldwide, concentrated among indigenous activists. Private police suppress activism, and in the US, states are actually creating laws to punish environmental activists as terrorists. Eighth example, in 2020, a senator campaigned for presidency on a platform of greening the United States military, which is the largest hydrocarbon consumer in the entire world, in which itself, of course, exists for little purpose other than ensuring burning the rest of the hydrocarbons. Ninth, an oil company, British Petroleum, BP, brands itself as green and popularizes the carbon footprint, famously putting the responsibility on the user instead of the producer. As a bonus, the same company now sells carbon offsets. You can, go to their calculator and figure out how much you've sinned and, purchase your indulgence. And it would have you believe that 16 tons of carbon dioxide, which is the American annual average, costs merely $72 to offset, giving you this illusion of purity for $72. Final example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change creates a scenario called RCP 2.6, which might allow us to stay under the 1.5 degree warming mark. It relies on technologies that don't exist or would cost $80 trillion to actually use. Okay, so what does all this mean? We are creeping closer to a limit on a carbon budget, right? At present emissions rates, we will exhaust the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has only 360 gigatons CO2 left in the budget by 2030. The problem is that fossil fuels are incredibly lucrative, and we are constantly investing in further exploration and cheaper extractive technologies. Any new infrastructure is expected to last 40 to 60 years, right? So when Biden approves a pipeline, that's a mockery of, whatever net zero by 2050 goals they set. In many years, the number of proven fossil fuel reserves actually climbs higher from the year before, year after year, as we find more fossil fuels and improve our extraction technologies, or governments, pump more subsidies in to make it cheaper to extract. At the moment, according to my tally of fossil fuels and converting those to greenhouse gas emissions, total fossil fuel value right now stands at $250 quadrillion. Let me say that again, because that's not a mistake here. Known global fossil fuel reserves that are extractable with today's technology and at today's prices, at my last count, were worth $246.8 trillion. But to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to strand 93% of that. And that's a big pile of money. Some higher estimates pin the amount of remaining coal much higher, with much more dire numbers, where we need to actually strand 99.7% of remaining resources. And if you think we're going to, strand 93 or 99.7% of $250 quadrillion, I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so fine. So what's the upshot? So governments, vaguely speak of fighting climate change without banning fossil fuels, even though under the Paris Agreement, targets will require us to keep almost all of it in the ground. Or we can deploy carbon capture technology to clean up the mess, but that will cost roughly $1 trillion per year. And if you think anyone's going to invest $1 trillion per year, then I call that climate denial, right? So essentially, we're hoping out of the goodness of their hearts, states and companies, the lords, will voluntarily walk away from assets worth so much money. So indeed, the symptoms proliferate, ever more foolish and violent. So to move towards a conclusion, I've been reading climate denial broadly construed along two indications from Freud, right? First, I've used the straightforward literal analysis of denial as Freud's two negations of judgment, one negating reality denial, one, and the other being a moral denial. But I've also referred to climate change as a conversion symptom of capitalism's irresolvable contradictions. And this has been more than a simile. Just as the hysterical symptom is a return in the body of a conflict in the psyche, so to speak. So too climate change and its violent and stupid symptoms are returns of a repressed, that is, returns of capitalism's intractable contradictions. You know, the tendency of profit to follow the highest, the path of highest return, pressure to lure investors with ever greater profits quarter after quarter, praise for unlimited expansion in a world of finite resources, labor exploitation and the destruction of nature, the allure of cheap energy no matter the cost, and most of all, the ability to discount the true ecological and social costs, which don't yet show up in the exchange value. So in such a deranged machine, climate change is a type of conversion disorder of capitalism, I would say. But in describing these symptoms with the academic term stupid and foolish that I've used, I have not said much about what I see as driving this repression, you know, a flight from shame or guilt. And I'm skeptical of finding the monocausal source of repression behind the ecological crisis, of course, but I'm sure that we can all agree that guilt is among the ingredients. Freud described guilt in a number of different ways, and in here I'm drawing mostly just from some of his notes in the latter part of Ego and the Id. But melancholic guilt comes from when an ego eagerly submits to the critical superego and just, you know, wants to submit, you know, and please it. Obsessionals seek out the analyst aid in repudiating the guilt. But most importantly, if we're reading climate denials as conversion symptoms, would be the hysterics guilt, which comes from the ego's active efforts to keep knowledge at a distance, right? So the generation of guilt works nearer the site of consciousness in the hysteric. At least according to Ego and Id, right? And I think the carbon offset, you know, I keep coming back to this, but the carbon offset is a modern form of, you know, of an indulgence, and it shows this consciousness of guilt at its purest, and of course at its most foolish. So if you don't know, the carbon offsets, you can buy carbon offsets for almost any activity now. As I mentioned, British Petroleum, now BP, first introduced the public to the term carbon footprint as part of its green rebrand in the early aughts. If you use that calculator today, you will be offered a chance to offset your emissions, whether for one flight, you know, say to a philosophy conference, or for your entire year. The price is absurdly cheap, like $72 to offset your emissions for that whole year. And that gives the customer the illusion that they have purchased purity for almost nothing. It's just high enough to feel like something, but it, you know, it keeps you from recognizing that, of course, it's not enough money to actually fix your emissions, right? So anyways, most offsets are built around a private company taking revenues and using some of that to plant trees on cheap land, which means that usually they're purchasing from poor tribes in the global south. In other words, when rich liberals buy carbon offset, what they are usually doing is unwittingly expropriating indigenous peoples of their land and livelihoods. But there's an even better example that I recently discovered that I just love. This company is called Yep You, right? And it's a very like accusatory name, Yep You. It bills itself as the world's first human breath carbon offset. Let me say that again, the world's first human breath offset. I really thought it was a joke when I first saw it, or some like brilliant performance art, but it's as real as confession gets, at least. So you exhale CO2 and you pay this company for the sin of breathing, and this company plants a tree for you on land that they swindled from desperately poor people. So how much does this cost? Well, if you want to offset your breathing for a whole year, $70. But if you also want to offset your entire economic existence, that'll run you more like $60, which is kind of in the realm of BP. That's a going rate. It's a, you know, part of the, it's the going rate for the grift, and it is a grift. These projects aren't effective. A recent European Union study showed that only 2% of these offsets projects meaningfully offset emissions even partially. But from a psychoanalytic orientation, you know, which shouldn't be content for long with mocking the nonsense that underwrites basically all of human desire. Yes, we can see that the allure of offsets has nothing to do with their efficaciousness. No, of course, what the subject purchases is not real purity, like real with a lowercase r, that is. No, what the subject purchases is a fantasy of guiltlessness. The subject wants to avoid the real with an uppercase R. By the way, your pet also can avoid the real too. The company lets you buy carbon offsets for your pet's breath as well. It's incredible. So this is the danger of our moment, right? We are increasingly aware that there is an ecological crisis we must address, and we are fantasizing subjects. We are subjects who desire, but we are not necessarily subjects who desire to know. We can fantasize a better world, envision it, unmake it, remake it, or we can use that same fantasizing capacity to simply negate the parts of reality we don't like, or wash our hands of it and feel pure because we've recycled or offsetted or protested or whatever. So I avoid preaching a solution since I'm conveniently aim to speak for like 20 minutes or so, and I'm out of my time. But on the subject of denial, climate denial, all denial, let me just finish with my favorite, perfectly brief quote from Lacan. In the seminar on anxiety, Lacan said, "Truth is not in desire's nature." Thank you.
That was good, thanks. Okay, so any questions for Tad?
Yep.
Okay, so Professor Barecki.
Believe you're muted.
Yes, that there is, your examples are very good examples for the denial, but there are also effective measures that are taken. Like 2 years ago, if you put solar panels, DC reimbursed you for 6,000, the federal government for 6,000. So I invested with solar panels on my garage for 22,000, and I got $12,000 reimbursed. So I only had to pay 10,000. And my wife was opposed to it, but I calculated it, and I cannot believe it. Every month we now get $300 from somewhere. So when we do not use immediately the electricity produced, it's sold. And so this is a strategy that was, but a $12,000 investment by DC and the federal government. And we have installed solar panels. So that is at least a step. And in Europe, you see on many houses solar panels. So you are probably right to say that will not do it, but it's at least a step by the federal government that made that, among others, me was putting up solar panels on my garage.
Yeah, no, that's something I support, and I'm hoping that we can keep turning up the subsidies on those and drop the subsidies on fossil fuels.
The subsidies on fossil fuels, that is unbelievable.
Yeah,
how much support there is still subsidies for.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of there's a number of further problems, so I'm not a doomsayer about it. Like I'm on the team that thinks that we have most of the solutions that we need already. Actually, it's simply that we refuse to pay for them. But there are myths even within like this thing about, like you'll very often find people saying that actually renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels now, which is patently false. It's kind of getting, and under certain conditions, it can be true, but it's mainly only true if we talk about like heavily subsidized renewables. There's also the fact that renewables are becoming cheaper largely because we're largely exporting production to China, where we're benefiting from practically slave labor conditions. These items are extremely toxic. There's no way to really recycle them. We have to strip mine salt flats in Bolivia. Like this is where, for things like lithium for like batteries and so forth, because like you'd have to do that if you want to use a lot of solar on your grid. You know, like Elon Musk, famously said, is regarding Bolivia, which has like about something like a third of the world's lithium is like right around Bolivia and 2 other countries around it. Elon Musk, famously said, we'll coup whoever we want for the lithium. So we have like all sorts of contradictions and problems. And I could like riff on that forever, so I'll wind this down. But yes, I think that's great. I fully support that. I hope to see more of that. My fear is that we have so much infrastructure tied up in fossil fuels that what we could do is start to see oil and coal companies and natural gas companies that have been very successful as billing themselves as clean for some reason. Natural gas is just methane. It's actually far worse, even though it's better per kilowatt hour. Well, I mean, it's global warming potential for methane is far, far worse on a limited time scale than carbon dioxide, but per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, it's about half that of coal. So they've been able to successfully portray themselves as green, and this is part of the emergency of our moment. Is like one of the reasons the United. Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll stop and allow for other. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is the US's emissions have gone down. And that's partly because we transitioned from one fossil fuel of coal to another fossil fuel of methane for energy generation. And this happened during Obama's reign, who signed the Paris Agreement and then 1 month later obliterated the oil export ban so that we could ramp up our fracking and start producing more fracked oil in the world. Right. So we have these contradictions everywhere, but I'll stop there. But thank you for that, because I think that it's important to say I'm very skeptical on like the very doomer, like there's no solution to it.
Tad, can you hear me? I guess that was really wonderful. I'm so happy that you're putting the tools of psychoanalysis to work on this problem. Really great. So this is going to be coming out as a book that you're working on.
Yeah. My manuscript is due over the summer, so it'll be a year or two before it actually gets out there.
Well, it's wonderful. I think it's essentially, I mean, in terms of the basic thrust of your argument and what it's going to illuminate, I would say bravo. That's wonderful. Really
Thank you.
great. My question is not really so much a question as just a putting out there kind of another dimension of all of this. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but I myself don't know what to think of it exactly, but it pertains to my long-standing fascination with this problem of dusting, and which then borders on the whole problem of the other. Even, of course, the famous Schmittian, opposition of friend and enemy. And I'm wondering how much you think we're already thinking about climate change. My own personal suspicion is that we're already largely or semi-consciously thinking about the whole coming climate catastrophe in terms of something like the global gated community, where some people are going to be able, no matter what happens, to sort of like, enclose themselves in a safe zone, which leaves out the desperate minions. Mm-hmm. And I'm just sort of wondering about, has that occurred to you in all of this, and is that part of what we're sort of facing as a challenge, to own this really as a problem for all of us, as opposed to the consequences of climate change will be the burden, as always, of the poor and disinherited of the world.
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Yeah. No, I actually I wrote like a chapter on migration, and I'm very interested in these projections of you get anything from like a few tens of billions of climate migrants by 2050 to the UN projects possibly as many as 1 billion climate migrants by 2050, which is nuts. That like, you know, by the time my daughter is, you know, in grad school or whatever, like the world would have displaced 1 billion people. So I ended up. Yeah, so I wrote a chapter that ended up sprawling. So I ended up deciding I wanted to divide it in two and have one for international migration and one for how this is going to affect Americans and white Europeans, because it's going to happen in different ways, right? Like when years from now, like, you know, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades from now, people in my generation are going to look back and say, like, what was the whole the craziness about, right? Because like we've gotten used to the wildfires and the floods, and the seas haven't raised yet because they happen on a 1 to 4 century time lag. You know, like, so the last time there was this much carbon in the atmosphere, the oceans were 75 meters higher. I mean, that's not going to happen for 4 centuries, right? So for a lot of it's going to look really normal for a long time, or we're going to adjust. But in other ways, we're not. Like another thing that happened in Portland that I didn't have time to talk about with my rather already long example is BORTAC was there, the Border SWAT team. And the Border SWAT team was deployed and ended up in unmarked vans, just kind of pulling up to Black Lives Matter protesters and abducting them off the streets. And some of those people are still waiting for their day in court and weren't even told who they'd been abducted by. Several of them thought that they were being abducted to be like killed by local militias. So that's an example of like sometimes it does come home to roost, right? But internationally though, we externalize borders, right? Like, so our southern border is only kind of fictionally with Mexico. The actual southern border is Mexico's southern border. We pay them a lot of money to keep the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua out, right? In Europe, there's the same thing with Africa. They literally pay Libya, for example, to try to redirect people into the Sahara, hoping that they will dehydrate and die. Or they can get crowded into one of these cities that we can drone strike later if we want to. And that's what migration is going to look like. It's not going to be mostly over borders. It's going to be internal displacement for the most part. And that means more terrorism, which means more war on terrorism that are water wars that will be framed as terror wars, right? And that's why I use this example of like, I think the greatest example is like when you saw in 2018 when Trump labeled this thing a migrant caravan and said, you know, there's terrorists in them. He's completely like, I mean, what's he doing? Like, if you remember 9/11, that was part of the justification for the Department of Homeland Security, right? Is that Al-Qaeda is sending, you know, all of the, you know, like, you know, Mexicans are coming across the border and a lot of them are also Al-Qaeda terrorists. They're going to blow up our buildings. So we need to create this sprawling new apparatus. And that was the justification for it. It was nonsense. Trump's mind just kind of loops in and out of timelines, right? And he just kind of grabs something from 20 years ago and says, well, you know, this migrant caravan probably has terrorists in it that are Muslim. They come here from Syria and they got all mixed in with the Guatemalans and now they're coming up, right? So what are you doing when you call someone a Muslim, right? What are you doing when you call families that are in desperate needs, trying to survive a drought, coming up for work and calling them Muslim? You're saying that they're killable or brutalizable, right? And I don't think it's that far of a stretch. I say this and people always laugh at me. I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that like the liberal position, give it 10, 20 more years, would be, hey, we don't do medieval border walls. We do smart borders with drones that guard and like, you know, sentry drones hazing migrants. People always kind of say, like, I think that's too extreme. Israel already does this. Israel has little rover drones that can machine gun people that try to get out of Gaza, and sentry drone tower turrets that can just like, you know, just like a, you know, an 18-year-old Israeli kid can just, you know, use his iPad to just gun down people. You know, these guns shoot 1.5 kilometers into Gaza, which is only 6 kilometers across. So I think that that's the brutality on the horizon, and it's going to look a lot different internationally than it does domestically for sure. But one day, it only takes one good fire to shut down supply lines into Los Angeles and starve 20 million people inside of a week, so like, what do you do with that? Right. So anyways, so thanks for that question. I don't know if anybody else had like a last comment or and I can stick around. I know that we're trying to aim on time, so I just want to be conscious of that.
How about 9:57? Daniel has a question. How about you get the last question, Daniel?
Oh, okay. I know Laura had a quick one. I'll try to be very quick. Yeah, I also like the project a lot, Ted. It's really cool. It's really great. It's really great. So much to say. Yeah, I mean, it is a rhetorical irrationalism that links up with some of the things I was saying about irrationalism by ideology, when Kamala Harris can effectively enforce migrant policy, which is just as similar in continuity with Trump, but that is somehow missed by the discourse. So there's much to say. I think the other thing that interests me, and I want to connect this to your study on evangelical ideology around dominionist orientations to environmental supremacy, a kind of like anthropocentric supremacy, which would be something similar to like my own father's position on climate change, which is it's too, in his eyes, it's too self-centered of us to think that we could affect, God's nature kind of idea. And I'm wondering, like, that itself circumvents the guilt. So I do see a lot of, like, I don't know, a non-existent guilt problem for a lot of people. And I could see that non-existence of guilt actually going on for quite a while amongst what we might call reactionary segments of the population, which in the United States is very large. So how do you diagnose that? Because you've talked a lot about, these hip Silicon Valley people. That's one segment, but what about this other segment?
And let me give like kind of a not terribly in-depth answer to that, because Laura's been waiting so long for the whole time, and I want her to be able to jump in if she can. So in my third book that came out a couple years ago on evangelicals, that was the motive for it was really interested in this question of how many Americans don't believe that there will be a 22nd century because Jesus comes back. And we have kind of a dearth of data about this, and almost no polling firms ask this question or ask it regularly in the same way. Nearest I can tell from finally, I just sat down and said, like, nobody else in the world cares about this question. And I grew up around most people, probably I grew up around, don't believe that there will be a 22nd century before Jesus comes back. So I'm interested in this question. And as far as I can tell, somewhere between a fifth and a third of Americans believe that God will destroy the earth before the 22nd century, right? So this kind of gets to, like, even if you do convince people that climate change is real, it's not clear that that would matter, right? As one pastor once told me, like, you can't destroy what God has promised to destroy. Like, you're working against God if you're recycling, right? And that's internally coherent, right? It's a delusion and an illusion, to use both of Freud's in Freud's senses, right? But it's a complex libidinal fantasy, right? Can we get Laura's question?
Is that okay? Sorry, Laura. Absolutely. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for this. I'll just make it as short as I can. Ted, on a psychoanalytic model, how do you understand the work that you're doing? Clearly, you already just said you don't want to present a lot of facts. I mean, the presenting of facts in and of itself is not going to be efficacious. So are you playing a role, something like the role of an analyst, helping people work through shades of denial, or change some of their own internal barriers or filters? Are you working on yourself? What are you doing? As you
that's a really great question. I get this versions of this from time to time, and actually I spent like a lot of my dissertation writing about it, and some in books, and I think about it a lot as a teacher, you can imagine, because I'm actually, I do actually push back against my full clinical psychoanalysis friends who will very often tell me that what I'm doing is wasting my life in the university because teaching has no effect. And I'm not willing to go there. I actually do think if we use the crudest analogy of information transfer, even that I think has quite a bit of value. So I think of what I'm doing in a classroom or in my writing as trying to do something sort of stitching together a university discourse and an analyst discourse, where what I'm really hoping to do is not to give someone the correct set of facts, but to either through some good example or some absurd way that I get all erratic when I present, or whatever effective component I can sort of activate, I'm hoping to activate their desire to learn a little bit more, right? This is why, as a teacher, you feel better. You don't really care that much if a student can just regurgitate stuff to you on a test. If they come to you after class and say, hey, I was Googling around the other night about something you said in class, that means more than every straight A, right? And that's because at that point you have activated a desire to know something, right? And I always I say this a lot, but I think of this is a spin off a psychoanalytic axiom that a character called Todd McGowan writes about. But I think of us as not subjects who desire to know, we are subjects who desire, right? And I always tell my students that we are not subjects who desire to know, we are subjects who desire, and only occasionally does that desire attach to knowledge, right? And when it does, that's a precious thing to tend and cultivate. But what I think of what I'm doing is just trying to make sense of this thing, and put it together in as compelling a way as I can. And if that activates some sort of affect, then that's wonderful. And perhaps nothing that I do matters, though, right? I think that is something that we have to really reconcile with, is that perhaps what we're trying to do by approaching these topics and ultimately does not matter, or it's just kind of tinkering around with the deck chairs, as they say, So I'm hopeful that that's not the case. But I do think the role of affect from something that Lacan would call an analyst discourse in seminar 17, especially, and continues on in 24. And I kind of worked out in my dissertation a whole theory of how to try to understand that with what he calls a capitalist discourse that Daniel mentioned earlier. But I don't know, it's probably more than I should say here. But yeah, thanks for that. I think that all we can do is try to toy around with affect and hope we trigger some desire to know here and there, at least in our role as educators and scholars, which is very different than an analyst, a real analyst's role. So,
Thanks.
Well, Tad, if it's any consolation, you have triggered my desire to know more about, denial related to climate change. I think I do it myself sometimes, so I'm going to pay more attention to it.
Yeah, well, that's the point. There's no escaping it, right? We all do it. So, no.
Anyway, thanks. That was great. And so I guess that's it. Daniel, are you gonna hit the off button, I guess?
I will. Just, thanks everyone. Really fun time. I wish we could be in person, but this was a great alternative. I hope we can do it again.
Excellent.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Wilfried.
And thank you for organizing it electronically, Daniel.
Daniel, can I ask before we all leave, can you send around emails for the participants?
Sure.
I particularly don't have Tad's email. That'd be great.
Yeah, we'll have to connect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
We'll have to
Happy to
connect.
do so.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks everyone. Good night.
All right. Excellent.